All right. Good morning, everyone. I I hope you can see my virtual background. I'm using two monitors today, so it's a little different for me. But I had the same idea as Tim and wanted to get that Pismo backdrop in my virtual background. So I'm happy to be here with you all. My name's Dr. Aubrey Oresti. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor, a credentialed school counselor in California, also a national certified counselor and a national certified school counselor. So I will, of course, talk a little bit about school counselors because that's my background. I'm happy to announce that I'm joining the faculty at San Jose State University this fall in the counselor education department. So I put my email on this cover slide this morning. I forgot to put it in that initial handout that you got from Corey. With that, I'm going to go ahead and jump in because we've got a lot of ground to cover. So a little bit about the session for today. I wanted to talk to you about always already stressors, the kinds of stress that is always already present for our TK-12 students. We'll talk a little bit about the current context that we find ourselves in. We'll move into some mental health implications and some things that you might be noticing in your students and perhaps even in your staff and faculty for that matter. I want to talk to you about complex grief, different forms of grief that you might notice in the coming terms, moving back into school this fall and beyond, some implications for our school communities, and then how to try to move forward through all of this. So let's go ahead and jump off with those always already present. So we have to begin by acknowledging that there are stressors that are always already present for our TK-12 students. These stressors are anything from challenges within the family, challenges in relationships with friends. It could be things like bullying or life transitions. And these stressors that our students experience cause stress. Stress is the body's physical, mental, and emotional response to these different challenges that we experience. Now, we have to remember that a lot of this stress or these stressors are normative. Normative stressors are expected, they're somewhat universal in nature. An example of a universal or normative stressor would be a change in a family system. So if I'm in fourth grade and I have a younger sibling being born, it causes that stress in the family system, but it's something that can be anticipated and prepared for. These normative stressors foster growth and development. What we worry about is the non-normative stressors. So these non-normative stressors are not universal. They cause severe or what's sometimes referred to as toxic stress. These non-normative stressors can also be considered trauma experiences. They overwhelm our ability to effectively respond, cope, and adapt in our life circumstances. So we sometimes think of these non-normative stressors or toxic stress in regards to trauma and adverse childhood experiences. And with this, it's particularly problematic over the long term. Chronic stress is damaging. We see those somatic complaints from people who experience traumatic stress. Adverse childhood experiences are those trauma experiences that have a lasting impact. So they happen before the age of 18, but those memories, those wounds last well into adulthood. And what we worry about with that is that we know that these forms of trauma and chronic stress can impair learning, behavior. We know that they contribute to mental, physical, and health problems. They have implications for brain development. They also impair immune system functioning. They can stunt growth, accelerate aging, and perhaps most importantly, they also lead to or can result in premature mortality and increased morbidity. So we know that there are these always already present stressors from normative to non-normative, traumatic, chronic, and then we find ourselves in this current context. So we really are in the midst of these dual crises, right? On the one hand, we have the global pandemic of COVID-19. On the other hand, we have the social epidemic of systemic inequity. Um, and we see these two crises as really contributing to the stressors that are always already present for our TK-12 students. So I want to start by thinking about COVID-19. And I was thinking about all of the different pieces that are involved with COVID-19, and I mapped them onto Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with this, but with Maslow's hierarchy, we see that each area of the hierarchy is reflected through the COVID-19 pandemic. So starting at our most basic needs, our physiological needs, we know that COVID-19 has disrupted food, the ability for families to adequately provide food. And we see food insecurity in many families in California and across the country. With safety, we know that we've seen housing instability issues, loss of employment. Those unemployment numbers just seem to keep growing week to week. And we know that it has also impaired access to medical treatment and access to equitable medical treatment across populations. With regard to love and belonging, we see that social isolation that comes with social distancing, right? Something that's intended to keep us safe is also potentially harming us at the same time. With esteem, we see increased stress and worry, lots of fear about this particular virus. And we also see stigma-related distress, stigma that comes along with particular groups and populations, as well as the virus itself. We've seen a lot over the past months and even just through this past week of government officials referring to the virus with particular racial slurs. And then finally, we know that with Maslow's hierarchy, we have to meet those basic needs in order to get to that ultimate place of self-actualization. But when these other needs are impaired, it's going to impair our ability for self-actualization. And we see that in the form of feeling helpless and feeling hopeless. So transitioning over to systemic inequity, or what we can really see as our history of racial trauma in this country, we know that unfortunately this is not a new issue. Our country is founded on racial trauma and systemic inequity. What is novel about what's happening now, the social epidemic that's happening now, is that we seem to be at what the scholar Malcolm Gladwell would call the tipping point of this social epidemic. We've seen a lot of social unrest in the last few weeks, protests, both peaceful and not, but lots of folks trying to take a stand against this inequity. So perhaps it's a tipping point or a breaking point. I think for many folks, the reality, seeing that cell phone video footage of George Floyd, 8 minutes and 46 seconds on a cell phone of a man losing his life in front of us, was just too much to bear. And folks started to feel like something had to change. So we've seen these names in the news, we've seen this horrifying video footage, and we know that we have a history beyond these past few weeks or months of this happening. So this racial trauma is a form of race-based stress. It's similar to post-traumatic stress disorder in how it presents, but it has this additional complication in that the wounds are chronic and they can be experienced on an individual level, but also on the collective level. This racial trauma is the result of persistent exposure and re-exposure to race-based stress. So this racial trauma comes from our history in this country of colonialism, institutionalized racism, internment of particular groups and populations, mass incarceration, and xenophobia. What I'm particularly interested in is where these crises, the pandemic and the social epidemic, where these crises overlap. So where they overlap is really the place of the least amount of power and privilege in our society. It's the place where there are the fewest resources. And I say that because we know that we have disproportionate representation in these various crises. So if we're thinking about just race, and there are lots of aspects of culture that we could consider in terms of sexuality and gender and age and socioeconomic status. But if we're looking at race, we see disproportionate representation in terms of COVID-19 infection rates. And we also see disproportionate representation based on race in mass incarceration and immigration detention centers. And again, these are populations where we see the fewest resources, the least amount of power and privilege, right? Not a lot to be able to effectively change the situation. So with these groups, we also know that they had those always already or pre-existing issues and stressors to contend with. With this crisis overlap, we see that those pre-existing issues and stressors are exacerbated, right? The issues are made worse. We also see that those issues are compounded. Those negative aspects of the pre-existing stressors are just intensified. And finally, they are conflated. So that means that these crises are inextricably fused together. And it's really difficult to tease out which part belongs to which because that systemic piece and that global piece is just causing everything to mesh together. Finally, when we think about all of those aspects of culture and identity, we have to consider how intersectionality plays a role in the context that we find ourselves in and in these overlapping crises. So our intersectionality of identity results in layers of discrimination, oppression, and trauma in our current context. And I really think about that with regard to our K-12 students and families and what they might be experiencing on all of these layers upon layers of oppression. So I go back and revisit the ACEs. And I think about the abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction in those ACEs. And it really struck me in working on this presentation that there isn't a single ACE that isn't represented in the dual crises of pandemic and social epidemic. There's potential for increased rates of child maltreatment. We've been seeing that in the news. Increased rates of domestic violence. We see increased risk of addiction, and we see vulnerability to mental illness during social isolation and social distancing. With regard to household dysfunction, thinking about those incarcerated relatives, my research focuses on adolescents or children of incarcerated parents and understanding more about their experience because most of the research is done from adult perspectives. And I think about this particular ACE with regard to these dueling crises. You know, family members who are incarcerated in jails and prisons or imprisoned in ICE detention facilities, we know that they are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 infection because they are not being provided with proper sanitation or safety equipment. And I know from my research with children of incarcerated parents and families who are contending with parental incarceration that they suffer from so much shame and stigma and these intense feelings of guilt and remorse and shame and sadness. And I worry about this added piece now of worry and anxiety regarding COVID-19 on top of everything that they were already contending with. And so that took me to another area of my research, which is grief. And so I wanted to share some of these different forms of what I call complex grief. That, you know, our straight up grief is normal, natural. Grief is a normal, natural response to any kind of a loss or significant transition or change in one's life. And grief in and of itself is a relatively universal feeling. Even animals grieve. And our modern scholarship also teaches us about not just the typical grief experience, but it focuses on these more complex forms of grief. So the first one is complicated grief. And complicated grief is a form of complex grief that involves feelings of loss that are just overwhelmingly unendurable, and that these feelings don't improve with time. It's ongoing, it's relentless grieving that really hinders a person's ability to accept the reality of loss and to resume normal functioning. So, anyone who's experienced grief in their lifetime, you know that those grief feelings can a tremendous weight on us and that they do feel overwhelming. But with time, with normal grief, it will shift, it will change into something that's different, into something that we can get through. But with complicated grief, it just really feels like that stuck, kind of stagnant place where the grief experience doesn't change from those very low depths of grief. The next form of grief I wanted to tell you about is ambiguous loss. So, ambiguous loss occurs as a result of an uncertain or a vague type of absence or loss in one's life. Um, a classic example of ambiguous loss is kidnapping. And so, with a kidnapping, someone is physically gone from the family's life, but psychologically, that child is present on the minds of the family members every day because they just don't know, right? That's where the ambiguity comes in. They don't know what happened to their loved one. Another example of ambiguous loss is where a person might have dementia and that person is physically present, their body is there, but psychologically they are gone. And so I think about ambiguous loss with regard to COVID-19 because we keep hearing these stories of people being in hospital and being in quarantine situations where families can't actually go say goodbye at end of life. Um, and that sort of ambiguity of knowing what happened at the end of life for their loved one, I think could contribute to the development of this complex grief of ambiguous loss. The next type of grief is disenfranchised grief, and it's caused by social values regarding some aspect of the loss. When a loss is socially stigmatized, we see disenfranchised grief. We also see this disenfranchised grief with not just the type of loss being stigmatized, but also the ways of grieving or the griever themselves. And so children are often disenfranchised in their grief because many don't recognize, honor, or really understand that children and adolescents do have a grief process. It it doesn't always look that different from the grief process of adults, but there are some characteristics that are unique to children in their behavior. Um, Disenfranchised grief can really interfere with the child's ability to grieve normally and naturally. And it can contribute to the development of complicated grief, which is that unrelenting, unendurable, overwhelming grief. The last type of grief I wanted to bring up, and I think it's something that you're going to be seeing in your school districts, because it's something that we're seeing in our world, is collective grief. And collective grief is a concept where we take the experience of individual grief, but we expand it to include the grief experience of a group or collective. And at this time, it is really inescapable, the grief that we feel on both the the pandemic and in terms of the social epidemic of systemic inequity. I think we have those collective racial trauma wounds. We have this collective grief, not just in California or the United States, but really in the world regarding COVID-19 and the losses of hundreds of thousands of loved ones and lives. Um, the loss of that feeling of safety and normalcy. I think many kids and families are experiencing this collective grief where we just don't really feel like ourselves right now, and we're sort of in this cloud or shroud of grief. So, as I said, grief is normal and natural. There are these complications, and we know that there are other forms of issues that we are starting to see potentially on the rise. And it's important to know what to look for. So, as someone who's studied counseling and psychology, I think about those kind of psychology 101 basics that we look at things in terms of affect, cognition, and behavior, or feelings, thoughts, and actions, right? So, we can conceptualize the changes that we might observe in terms of these feelings, thoughts, and actions. We have to remember with mental health that the symptoms are not a a one size fits all. Um, Symptoms that we see with mental health disorders or mental health diagnoses, we see them as manifesting at all different kinds of levels. So, one symptom might be very pronounced in one individual, but it might be more subtle in someone else. And so, it's important to know kind of more generally what to look for, and then how to start to gauge it, and then to know how to get consultation and help from our school-based mental health professionals. So one thing that I've been thinking about, having worked with middle schoolers and high schoolers in my time as a school counselor, is really thinking about how social distancing is affecting the lives of adolescents in particular. uh, Social distancing from friends is particularly disruptive to adolescents because adolescents rely on their peers for socialization. And that socialization, that starting to move away from parents and other adults in their lives and moving toward peers is really a developmental hallmark of adolescence. And it's something important for them in their normative development schema. And that has certainly been disruptive. And that can have implications on their self esteem, sense of self, identity. Um, I also think about the students who maybe didn't qualify for a full fledged mental health diagnosis. So, that category of student, we would consider them to be at sub threshold levels of a diagnosis. So, if a diagnosis requires 6 criteria to be met, maybe that student had 4 out of 6 or 5 out of 6. This time of tremendous stress and overlapping crises and stressors could and may have exacerbated those pre-existing issues for students. And so some of those students who were at kind of sub-threshold levels, I'm afraid that we're going to start to see some rise in some of those sub-threshold levels into a full-fledged diagnosis. In addition, for K-12 students who were kind of at normative levels, because there is a normal amount of sadness and worry and stress that we feel in our lives. For those students who are at normative levels, that all of this added stress in their lives might bump them up to a non-normative level. So the diagnoses that I'm particularly worried about in terms of mental health with our K-12 students include anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders, and substance abuse and addiction. Like, these are the things that we commonly see with our K-12 students anyway. And at this time, with those added stressors, again, moving from normative or sub-threshold levels into that potentially diagnosable level is of concern, I think. And we know that many of these diagnoses also work in tandem. So we have to also be mindful of that potential for co-occurring disorders. For example, obsessive compulsive disorders or anxiety disorders with eating disorders, and kind of those issues coinciding. We also see a very strong relationship between anxiety and depression. We know that children who experience anxiety disorders are more likely to experience depression diagnoses in adolescence. And then when we see those depression diagnoses in adolescence, we have a higher likelihood or correlation that we'll see that depressive disorder into adulthood for those young folks. So really trying to work to recognize the different diagnoses early and intervening early is important. So some things to look for in terms of feelings, looking at not just the normative levels, but the non-normative levels, those persistent or unrelenting levels of sadness, fear, worry, anger, guilt, shame, regret. With regard to thoughts, things like difficulty concentrating or focusing. We also see rumination, or that kind of persistent thought process, kind of single-minded focus sometimes with rumination. A pessimistic worldview, a more negative worldview. I think that can also go in tandem with anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is not something that folks talk about very often because it's not necessarily something that happens all that often in terms of phenomena, but it is something that we're seeing now with COVID-19. And anticipatory grief is sort of a waiting for the other shoe to drop, knowing or assuming that something bad is going to happen, that a loss is coming, and sort of being in that anticipatory space of those bad things happening. One of the thoughts that I think we have to mention here, I have to mention here, is suicidal thoughts. With depressive disorders, suicide is one potential criteria for that disorder, and suicide is something to always be taken seriously and to always be addressed. Having people on campus, school counselors, school psychologists who know how to assess for suicide, or if you don't have a counselor or psychologist, having those crisis response teams in your community who can assess for suicide and to really provide support and help in keeping those young folks safe. The last piece is actions. And so with actions, we might look for those somatic complaints. We know that those somatic complaints can come with our chronic stress, the tummy aches, the headaches, feeling really tired or fatigued. We might see irritability, changes in eating patterns, either higher or lower, changes in weight, gaining and losing, changes in sleep, having that inability to sleep or the insomnia type of result, or just not being able to get enough sleep and sleeping all the time. We also can observe regression, kind of that return back to a different age or stage, and acting out behaviors. So I think we see those, elementary school kids who start sucking their thumbs again, or having some of those younger early childhood types of behaviors. Our teenagers, our high schoolers, we might see them having some pretty amazing tantrums as part of what to look for. And then ultimately we might see changes in grades or academic performance, and we might see increased absenteeism. With this time of remote learning, distance learning, online platforms, it can be hard to judge all of this and to really understand what we're seeing. But again, it's important to keep that broad spectrum of feelings, thoughts, and actions, to try to see if there's anything that feels like it's out of the ordinary. So this brings us to implications for our school community. I think implications really comes into two parts for our school communities. The first is the necessity or the need for training. Training to increase knowledge of issues connected to these crises, like these complex forms of grief, stigma, and really working toward building multicultural competence. The second piece is interventions. So we can learn, but then what do we do, right? And those interventions are really intended to be theory-based interventions that are effective in helping students to process their emotions, to understand and articulate their thoughts, and to engage in adaptive behavior. We know that the the pull and the tendency with stressors is to have unhealthy coping. So we want to be able to really cultivate those healthy coping tools. We want to foster those peer connections and bring our students together to reduce shame and stigma and build awareness. So we do this by supporting our school community through, I would recommend, school counseling strategies. I have the students in the center here on purpose because I feel like the students are always at the center of our work, and that our teachers, our administrators, our staff, our support folks, and the larger school community and families hopefully can all come together in service and in support of our students. So from a school counselor's perspective and vision, we would use indirect and direct interventions. And so these indirect interventions would really involve the larger school community and teachers. It might be one-on-one consultations with teachers, doing a Zoom meeting with teachers about particular students that they might be concerned about. They start noticing things in their Zoom classrooms that they want to ask the school counselor, school psychologist, what should I do here? That's something that we would ordinarily do in person. That's something that we would ordinarily do all the time in passing period in the hallway. Working as a school counselor, I had daily consultations with teachers. So I think it's important to remember that toolkit that we already built in person and to apply that into our virtual environments. I also thought about teachers and support staff, administrators, and thinking about these school counseling strategies where we provide these services at individual, group, classroom, and school-wide levels. And we can have these one-on-one check-ins, but I think that applying that same model for teachers and staff is important. And we might even consider doing something like a check-in group for faculty and staff. So maybe helping our faculty and staff to come together for a check-in group about professional development, right? Something where they're checking in about best practices with online learning environments or distance learning platforms. Maybe they're helping each other to grow. Probably they're sharing some frustrations at the same time, but I think a school counselor could help to create a simple outline and curriculum, and then send the teachers on their way in that check-in group to just provide that extra support for our frontline staff. Classroom visits, I think, are another way to support our school community. If a teacher is having a Google Meet session with their class, having the school counselor be an active member of that class, having an invitation to join that class, and perhaps helping out with some classroom workshops, doing some short mindfulness lessons, some breathing activities, and doing some shoulder rolls and neck rolls to get rid of that Zoom neck that we're experiencing. Adding something into the classroom to, again, really cultivate those healthy coping strategies and stress management techniques. At a school-wide level, I think faculty meetings could be used for an in-service to review these different signs and symptoms of mental health, the kinds of things that we might see in our K-12 students, what to look for, and then ultimately how to address some of these issues that we're seeing. I also think it's important at this time, because we know that every ACE is represented in COVID and systemic inequity. I think it's very important for schools to really revisit mandated reporting requirements. With so much going on, I think it's something that we can kind of forget about. But I would definitely have that as something that comes early in the fall, to have a mandated reporting refresher for a school-wide level to just make sure that folks remember their requirements. So we can take care of the teachers and staff, but we also need to keep in mind the heart of the school, right? Our students. And Addressing individual, group, classroom, and school-wide can be done with students by fostering supportive peer relationships, avoiding isolation, looking at ways to build resilience and recovery from trauma. I would really encourage you to focus on special populations or notice special populations within your school communities, looking at children of incarcerated parents. As I mentioned, they're a particularly vulnerable group. Looking at students who are part of undocumented families and knowing that this is a time of tremendous stigma and risk for these vulnerable families. Um, at the group level, I think offering group counseling related to grief and racial trauma and stigmatized losses. Every school should have a grief group and multiple grief groups that run throughout the year. The classroom level, again, having stress management techniques and healthy coping strategies. And at the school-wide level, I would really like to encourage folks to find ways to honor our collective grief experiences through memorials, through art, and through grief education. Teaching our K-12 students about the experience of grief, the normal, natural experience of grief, and how that experience can go awry, and to be able to have language for our students about what grief is, how it feels, so that they know that they can talk about it and avoid that complex types of grief. So how do we do all of this? Well, one way that we do it is by addressing ourselves at the same time. So we do that through self-care. And self-care involves intentional practices, activities, and/or rituals that promote self-awareness, self-regulation, or coping skills. And self-care is a balancing between self and others' interests. As educators, I think we often put the needs of others before our own. That's anti-self-care. So sometimes we overcorrect and we do more of a focus on ourselves and not enough on others. So we have to remember that this is really a balancing between self and others. Ultimately, self-care is important in avoiding burnout. Burnout involves exhaustion, depleted resources, heavy demands that continue despite the depletion of resources. Burnout negatively affects our mood and relationships, and ultimately it can lead to a lack of professional objectivity. So we want to make sure to practice self-care so that we can avoid those traps of burnout. Um, Self-care and a healthy self-care program will help us to cultivate meaningful and healthy relationships, which is important in our personal development and professional development. And finally, I suggest sustainable self-care. Sustainability is about how to maintain something over time. And so it's important to think about how are you going to maintain your self-care practices over time, right? When you feel that pull toward the interest of others and you feel those demands weighing on you heavily, how will you schedule time for self-care? So it may mean something that you do on a weekly basis or twice a month or once a month, but it should be something that is intentional and that you really plan for that time for yourself. So moving forward, I want to remind us that we've never been here before. We've never been exactly in this place. But I want to hopefully reassure you that we do have the skills and training to play a key role in supporting the mental health of our school communities. Um, I think the first part of that comes in trying to instill hope. So as educators, it's important for us to maintain a long-term vision, even in the midst of acute crisis. We have to restore balance in our own lives through self-care. We have to be mindful of the things that we're grateful for and find inspiration in the things that matter to us. So that might be revisiting a favorite author, maybe performing a spiritual practice, or committing to an exercise program, because ultimately we need that hope in order to heal. Healing at this time in our collective grief is imperative. Part of that is about addressing the anxiety and the overwhelm that our school communities are feeling, our students and families are feeling. So that means, really trying to have regular communication that is as transparent as possible with our communities. We know that we don't have all the answers today, and we probably won't have them tomorrow, and things are subject to change. But having those regular check-ins with our school communities will hopefully quell some of that anxiety. We also need to help find ways to connect folks and maintain some semblance of community, even if it's in a virtual space, like y'all are doing today, not at the beach, but through Zoom, and just trying to keep that feeling of community alive. We can encourage healing through expressive arts. I'm a big fan of expressive arts. Thinking about planning those virtual concerts with your school orchestras and bands, having some photo galleries that can be done virtually, or slideshows. I've noticed a lot in the past months in my community. I've noticed a lot of sidewalk chalk art. And I was thinking about how fun it might be to have a sidewalk chalk art blog where families can share some of the messages that they've been putting on their driveways and on their sidewalks in their community about Black Lives Matter, or being safe and healthy, the drawings and pictures of rainbows representing COVID-19. Ultimately, I think we have to go back to the mantra of the educator, and really thinking about the fact that, like, we got this. We know how to be flexible. We know how to be adaptable. I feel that as a school counselor, as a teacher, we know how to do unpredictable when we work in education. So we truly are made for these dual crises. We got this, and we can do it. I wanted to leave you all with a few websites and community-based organizations, some readings that you might be interested if you want to continue to explore these topics. Some of them might look like they're location specific, like in the pandemic side, Bay Area resources. But once you click into some of these resources, you'll see that a lot of them are also maybe housed in the Bay Area or housed in Southern California, but they have virtual implications as well. So I thought that would be a nice way to have a starting or jumping off point for folks. And I'm not sure if there are questions.
There are. So we have time.
Okay.
We're going to take two of the questions that we've got
Okay.
in the chat. So the first one was, has there been any research regarding the lasting psychological impact of making younger students socially distanced 6 feet? This is one thing we're having a hard time wrapping our heads around. Also, we don't think that this is sustainable for younger students or for our adolescents.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I don't know how sustainable it is. It's very confusing to, I think, our younger children, it's very confusing. Our older adolescents are really missing that socialization. I see in my own neighborhood, anecdotally speaking, I see kids with their masks and trying to ride bikes 6 feet away. I've heard stories from parents trying to do social distance slumber parties or social distance hikes and bike rides. And I think that people are continuing to try to find ways to move around social distancing because they're struggling. They're having a hard time, and seeing the sadness, seeing that listlessness in their children and adolescents. And at the same time, we know that this is important in terms of transmission of COVID. So some of the things that I think have been helpful to families is setting up those, virtual play dates. Like, this is a virtual conference, kind of doing the same sort of things that we're doing for ourselves to get through work for our kids. and continuing to have that open communication and dialogue with our families, allowing our kids and our adolescents to say, I don't like this, or you're mean, or I hate you. You know, some kids are saying that. I think we're seeing some early research about COVID. We've seen a lot more focused on the younger kids than on adolescents. I'm involved in a research project right now, a national study looking at undergraduates, um, so a little bit older than our K-12 students, but I'm seeing the same things coming out in that data from our early collection. We're seeing that what people miss is their friends. And the other piece that they're missing, and I think that this would map on for our K-12 students, is they're missing the structure. So as much as possible, trying to have that structure, even if it doesn't look exactly the same as it would look in our in-person or on-ground instruction in our on-ground schools, trying to have some set routines and structure. Our kids and adolescents and even our emerging adults really need that to feel some semblance of normalcy.
Great. And then we just have time for one more question. So, in
Okay.
many of our small district communities, they have many people, families who think of the pandemic as hype and want to follow their guidelines or no guidelines, not CDEs or the governor's. How do you deal with the rule following possibly OCD students who'll be struggling with the rule of conformity issues between home and school?
Mhm. So I've definitely been hearing a lot of this. I think even where I am in the Bay Area, there are, um, you know, pockets of communities that are having a harder time really understanding the seriousness of COVID-19 and thinking that it's hype. I think because we've been fortunate to not have as high of infection rates as some other parts of the state, um, maybe the reality of it just isn't sinking in. I think with following guidelines, um, we can only do so much. We can explain why, we can explain how, we can show some images of how to wear masks and how not to wear them, reminding about washing hands and things like that. But ultimately, there is a trust that we're putting in our families that they are going to adhere to those guidelines, and we just don't know. Um, and that's where we have to decide for our school communities what is best for the entire community, and do we trust that families are following these protocols. When we're So I think the second part of that question was about students with OCD. Is that right? Is it this possibly OCD students who'll be struggling with the rule of conformity issues?
Right.
uh, with students who have OCD, it's actually a really interesting time. I was talking to a colleague of mine who's a researcher who was saying that some students who have OCD, or some young folks who have OCD, are actually doing a little bit better, which feels counterintuitive. But because the generalized anxiety in our society is heightened, they almost feel like their anxiety, their obsessive and compulsive thoughts and disorders are normalized. Um, so they're feeling like instead of an exacerbation of issues, they're sort of just maintaining where they are, and they're feeling a little bit validated, which again is more anecdotal from a colleague researcher of mine. But um, I think again having that open dialogue and discussion with school personnel and families about what is needed. There isn't a one size fits all symptomology, and there's not a one size fits all intervention. But having those open dialogues, knowing what's needed, knowing how to support that family from their perspective, I think is important. Getting that information early and then making adjustments as necessary throughout the school year. Um, I think for students who struggle with OCD or with other anxiety related type disorders, uh, there's a debilitating force in those disorders that's different than some of the other disorders that we see. So remembering that this is something that the student can't necessarily control or change, instantaneously, and trying to put in those healthy interventions to support them through this difficult time and to support them through the potential stigma that they're experiencing.
Aubrey, thank you so much. You did a wonderful job, and we got to get moving on. If you could possibly stick around, look at some of the Q&A. There's some great questions, especially around where can we get some more access to art therapy, group counseling. Any tips you can give us would be wonderful. And I agree. I think the arts is a great way to deal with everything going on. Just one last thing to think about and maybe get back to us on. We have a lot of members who are in communities that are very conservative and white. And I think the multiple issues that the kids are hearing at home about institutional bias, racism. We saw the issue with the NASCAR. Our governor's made it very clear he is not funding small rural communities that are primarily white. He's using more of a kids of color approach. He's given us about 17% of the money. The other 80% is going to large urban and high concentration and supplemental areas. So all this is taking place in our small district members who then have to come back to school. Kids are hearing stuff within the home. And it's a complicated thing. And I think maybe you could kind of think about that and get back to me, and I'll get it out to our members here, because I think we have multiple things that we're facing beyond the COVID and in some of our communities, and it's going to be a very difficult challenge, I think, for teachers to deal with that and the stress the kids are feeling and the trauma they're feeling beyond COVID. So
absolutely, we see that potential for really fomenting systemic inequity, and we've seen that in in a couple of the small towns in California. We've seen some recent hangings of folks of color, and really worrying about what's happening here, and yes, absolutely thinking about what's going on at home, and then how do we address it at school.
Great. Well, thank you. My mom went to San Jose State, so congratulations. That's a great school, and they do good there, do well, and let us know if we can help continue to collaborate and work together. Corey's going to move us on to the associates who are going to transition us, and congratulations. We had our first winner, Sherry Martin guest, Silence of the Lambs. The only problem is I'm still watching, the movie's still on, and it's scary. I got to turn it off before I freak out here. So Corey, take over.
Sounds good. And thank you again, Aubrey, so much. We really appreciate you being here today. So right now we're going to have some commercials from our associate members. We have a few that are on today with us because, unfortunately, we can't be here in person, have you visit them at their tables. They're going to give you some 90-second commercials, if you will, on some products and services that they're offering right now to help you get prepared for the fall. So the first one I'd like to invite up is Nicole Smith from ClassLink. You on, Nicole?
Yes, I am. Sorry. I promise I know how to unmute.
No worries. If you want, I don't know if you need to share your screen or not, but I
do need to share my screen. I heard loud and clear, no actual videos. So watch how fast I can do this. So share screen, and hopefully I got this down to work correct. So many screens to share.
Nicole, Corey, who's next?
Next would be Michael from East Shore. So if you want to be on deck, Michael.
Perfect. All right. Can you guys see my screen? Does it say sign into ClassLink?
It sure does.
Okay, awesome. All right, in 90 seconds, so let's do this. So ClassLink are a tool that supports remote learning. What we are is a single sign-on platform. We do a bunch of things behind the scenes that empower this, but essentially it's been really powerful, especially these last seasons, because it's a one-stop shop that people can go to. I'm quickly zooming through some of these examples of some of our partner districts, but one place where your parents, your students, and your teachers can go to log into all the resources that they're using. And then once they're here, they have all the different programs, collaboration tools, everything that they need to access without having to worry about usernames and passwords. Something that we have for teachers when it comes to collaboration and aid is a way for them to see all the students in their class. I can send out announcements to them. I can assign applications to them. But what's really powerful is I can also see who's been logging in, how much time they are spending in the different applications, and I can even drill down to those specific applications and see exactly what they're doing and again how much time they're spending. So this has been really helpful, because one of the complaints and things that we've heard is it's very difficult to see where students are struggling, what they are actually spending their time on, and what that looks like. So this is an example by a teacher, but you can also see this at a district level. So this is an example of some of our analytics here. And what these analytics allow you to see at the district level is everything. So you can see every app that's being launched. You can see how many launches, the total time spent, the average time of those launches. You can do a search and quickly see every application. Again, not only total time that's spent in there, but how much those applications are costing. There's a lot of information in here, but really the bottom line for ClassLink is seamlessness and visibility in a secure platform. We are in all 50 states. We're in 16 countries. We have a little under 200 districts here in California of all sizes. And the last thing I'll say is if you want to learn more, I would encourage you to check out our website at classlink.com. We do charge for those who are in the classroom on a full-time basis. So your full-time teachers and then your students, but you will get a district-wide enterprise license. And we do have a pretty substantial discount that we are offering to SSDA members. We know that your budget issues are tight and that California itself is going through an extreme budget cut. So we want to be able to make sure we can get the tools that are needed to support learning and instruction in your hands. So with that, I thank you so much. My email address, if anyone has any questions, is nsmith@classlink.com. Thank you so much, Corey.
Great, thank you so much, Nicole. So next we've got Michael from East Shore, and then Chris from Piper, you're on deck.
There we go. Good morning, happy Friday, everybody. You can see my screen, correct?
No, we cannot.
You can't?
Nope.
Interesting.
And you just click share screen on the bottom?
Yeah.
Yeah, you shouldn't have any issues. And Nicole, you stopped sharing your screen, correct?
I did, yes. You guys don't see it, right?
Nope.
It's giving me the option to share it again, so I assume it's gone.
Michael tries, oh, there it goes.
There we go.
We're good.
Technical challenges.
No worries.
We're going through with all the Zoom calls. So good morning, happy Friday to everybody. I hope you're all doing well despite the recent craziness and everything going on in the background, and that you all get to dress up like Tim and have a little fun this summer, sometime this summer, at least a little bit too. I'm sure I know some of you, as we've worked extensively with SSDA and many smalls over the past decade plus, but my name is Michael Riemenschneider. My company is called eShore Consulting. We are municipal advisors or bond guys. Perhaps more importantly, we are proud to be our clients' fiduciaries and offer responsible, sober advice, which is particularly critical right now as you all work your way through the most significant crisis of at least the past decade. And we've been working with Tim and Corey to provide that to as many of you as possible. In fact, last month we hosted a webinar with SSDA on COVID's impact on bonds, construction facilities, really trying to make the most of the crisis and take every opportunity to plan for your needs post-pandemic while going through all the steps and layers of reopening your campuses over the next few months. We'll be hosting another similar webinar during New Soups later this summer, but I'm most excited about a couple new services for smalls we've been working with Tim to more directly help you all right now. One of those services is that we'll be asking for any facilities questions you might have, whether on bonds like we do or construction, anything else related. And then for free, we'll be working with the whole webinar team to get them answered for you. Secondly, it's never too early to start preparing for the deferrals that are coming. So we're working with Tim to develop a strategy to help you and your board and really all smalls deal with that too, particularly as the state heads into what's likely a long-term economic crisis. So be on the lookout for more details on both of those things soon. And of course, our contact information is right here on the screen if there's anything we can do for you more immediately. Otherwise, kudos to Corey and Tim for making this regional still happen and everything else you guys are doing despite all the background challenges. And thank you all so much for giving me a little bit of your time.
Thanks so much, Michael. So now we'll move to Chris from Piper and Jim from Teachers Pension. You're on deck.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, can you guys see my screen with the slide up front?
Sure can.
Okay, perfect. All right, my name's Chris Bauman. We're going to be talking about the Piper Computer Kit. If I can advance the slide here. So the Piper Computer Kit, it's a STEAM program where kids build their own computer. So when you think about Piper, think STEM or STEAM, computer science. We're focused heavily on distance learning right now, after school and summer camp previously. And we're really targeting elementary and middle school students. Our curriculum is standards aligned, is very flexible, whether you have 8 hours or 60 hours. It can be run by a non-technical teacher or facilitator. We really focus on the K-12 computer science standards, NGSS, ISTE, and we've recently brought in English language development into our program. So the kids build their own computer. It's like a wooden puzzle with all the electronic parts that make up a fully functioning computer. The instructions are part of the experience. To build the computer, they have a big poster with blueprint. And the main tool they use is a Phillips head screwdriver. After the computer is built, we're going to start teaching them how to build electronics. So we do this in a really fun way. So the instructions for building electronics are inside our custom Minecraft projects. So Minecraft is a really fun and engaging thing for kids. And really it's a language that the kids understand. So we show them instructions in Minecraft, they're going to get it, and they don't need to be asking an adult for help. So once we get through learning how to build inputs and outputs using the Minecraft instructions, then we're going to get into coding. We use drag and drop coding from Google Blockly. And really with distance learning, number one, our product's always designed to be reused. And number two, we've built a safe handling protocol. So as the kits are reused, they can be sanitized through a scientific study that we're using. Time and heat will kill germs on the Piper computer kit. So we've got a safe handling protocol. We've also got really fun collaboration tools. This is an example of a Padlet collaboration for a distance learning program that was used at the end of the school year. We sell Piper in bundles, and so you get Piper Computer Kit spare parts, so you can replace parts as they're reused. It includes curriculum, and it includes training as well. SSDA, we love you guys. For those that you can scrap some money together by the end of June, 25% off, and then we'll offer 15% off through August. And to get that discount, you can go to our website or contact me directly. My contact info is on the next slide. And we know that it's difficult to find money for STEM products in computer science, especially in the current environment. Let us help you. We'll help you, go after ACES money, Title I. Migrant education is the #1 resource used to buy Piper Computer Kit in California. 21st Century Learning. We're here to help you. We've got experts on staff we'll write grants for you as needed. Here's my contact information. I appreciate your time. You guys have a great Friday.
Thanks so much, Chris. So
Thank
now
you,
we've
Corey.
got Jim from Teachers Pension, and then we will finish up with Elliot from STS Education.
So I need Chris to unshare his screen so I can get mine.
Yep, did that.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Corey, it says Chris is still sharing.
Let's see. Chris, if you go on the bottom of your Zoom under share screen, it should allow you to click off of that now.
Yeah, I'm trying to get there.
Let's see. You know what, Jim? I just made it so that you can start sharing with someone else is sharing. See if it'll allow you to just go over them. There we go. Problem
Thank
solved.
you.
Yep. Yeah, let multiple people share.
Perfect.
All righty. So good morning, everybody. On behalf of Teachers Pension, I'm very pleased to be with you again. We love working with the SSDA members. We're proud to be an SSDA Platinum sponsor, as well as a strategic partner of Kevin Gordon Capital Advisors. And we operate from a belief that every employee, both certificated and classified, deserve a dignified and a financially sound retirement. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions. How have you helped your employees plan for retirement starting on day 1? 2, do you know that retirement planning can reduce your personnel cost? And 3, do you know that retirement planning can be done at no cost to you or to the employee? According to STRS and PERS, the average retiree receives only 56% of his or her final salary. Therefore, they need to start planning as soon as possible to close this income gap. Last year, the income gap was a little over $3,200 for an STRS member. So as Teachers Pension, we take a multi-tiered approach to it. I come out of C&I and look at this as RTI for retirement planning. We are committed to educating all employees so that they are informed and making good choices about their retirement plans and closing the gap. We assist districts in effectively and efficiently managing retirement plans that can reduce your personnel costs. And since we are a consultant broker, we're not a vendor. We don't sell any products. We work with you with your district approved 403V and 457 vendors. Most importantly, we work to create the right environment, which includes education, technology, flexibility, and reduced staff workload, and most importantly, increased retirement choices for your employees. And as I said, we do this at no cost to you as a district or to your employees. Due to COVID-19, we've obviously switched from on-site meetings to online meetings, and because we don't need employees at a site, we're continuing our online meetings and presentations throughout the summer. And we've adjusted to include provisions of the CARES Act and how it affects retirement. So we're looking forward to working with you again. We've worked with many of you, and I'll put my email contact in the chat room. So thank you very much, and we appreciate supporting you all the time.
Thank you so much, Jim. And then last but certainly not least, we've got Elliot from STS Education, and we can see your screen, so you're all good.
Perfect. Corey, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Elliot Levine, Chief Academic Officer at STS Education. And STS supporting K-12 school districts isn't just something we do, it's all we do. And we work, and we have the great honor of working with a lot of school districts across California. It's really unfortunate that we have to really talk about some of the challenges that school districts are going to be facing in the fall. And what I'd like to do in just that 90 seconds is highlight just 3 ways that STS can help your district this summer and into the fall. So challenge number 1, distance learning rules that are being proposed in legislation AB 77, potentially requiring schools to confirm students have the necessary technology at home. And currently, according to EdSource, more than 700,000 students across the state of California still need devices. STS has both new and refurbished laptops and Chromebooks in stock and available to order. And we've got some creative ways to fund those purchases as well. Second up, district staff are extra busy this summer with site preparation. You may not necessarily have the staff time necessary to clean, test, disinfect, as well as repair all the devices that have been home for the last 12 weeks. We're the first ed tech company that's offering device decontamination. And this method uses hydrogen peroxide fogging. It's the very same technology used in hospitals to sanitize all the devices for your organization, giving peace of mind to parents and staff, and also freeing up your IT staff to focus on more strategic tasks at hand. And lastly, so many faculty have been struggling delivering remote teaching. And in fact, a recent survey from NDR found a huge disparity between the challenges administrators believed existed from teachers and what teachers said the problem was. In fact, 1 in 6 teachers said specifically they lacked training to be effective for remote teaching. So besides group professional development, whether live or in person, we're offering virtual one-on-one coaching, where we can work hand in hand remotely with any faculty member in your school system that's really struggling to help enhance their skills. So if there's anything we can do to help your district with these or any other ed tech solutions for the upcoming school year, please call or email me. I'm going to put my information right in the chat window as soon as I'm done sharing. And again, have a great rest of the conference, and seriously, thank you all for everything you've been doing. I know there's a lot of parents who have been complaining. I hear it left and right, and I was a former school administrator myself, but there's a lot of parents who really appreciate everything you're doing for their children. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Elliot. And I also wanted to mention that all these associates you've heard from, plus the ones you'll hear from later today and others who couldn't join us today, are part of a virtual exhibit hall that we've put together. And I just put the link for that in the chat, so please feel free to download that when you get a chance and check out all the different products and services that all of our great associates are offering to you guys.
Hey, Corey, thanks to everybody. And of course, I'm looking at my laptop right now that has a lot of germs hanging on it, food and everything. And I can't imagine what a young teenager's computer looks like after working all over a weekend or all night. So thanks to all of you, and Elliot, good seeing you and everyone else. Corey, before we move on, I got another trivia question for people because we got to keep it light, because I do want people to know I'm working behind the scenes right now. We're looking to sponsor a bill that's being hustled right now to help to prevent anyone suing schools around COVID issues. So we're looking for a sponsor for the bill. So we're working with some of our Republican friends to get that going. We'll see where that goes. We're being pushed back heavily by the Attorneys Association of the world. So they've got a lot of money and we don't, but Capital Advisors feels we're in a good spot with the other associations. Okay, it's a theme, it's kind of relevant to today's world. A theme song from a TV show from the 80s. No, there's no lyrics, so you can't Google it, so ha-ha to you. So here we go. First person to name the theme of this TV show gets a $10 gift card.
We're getting some answers.
Hey, Barry nailed it. Chips. Barry Barnhart. I'm a little worried that you knew that so quickly. You must have had a crush on those guys. They were funny. So Chips is the winner. Good job, Barry. And we're looking forward to our next presentation on special ed. And it's always good to have a couple attorneys on, and looking forward to hearing about special ed. And of course, Heather and Mike can also steer off and answer other questions while we got them on. So looking forward to this presentation. Corey, is there anything else we need to get going?
Yeah, so Mike and Heather, if one of you guys want to share your screen for your PowerPoint.
Hey, hold on a second. Barry, you know way too much about Chips. He said it's the only English show playing on Japanese TV. That's interesting. Here we go. Hey, good to see you guys. Heather and Mike, good seeing you guys.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Excellent. We can all see your screen, so you are good to go.
Great. I just want to check in with Heather and make sure she is also fully technologically functional here as well. So Heather, can you hear?
Is. Yep, I'm here. Thanks so much, Mike.
Great. Excellent. So Heather, why don't you kick us off here?
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for having us. We will see if we can catch us up a little bit on time. So we'll try to jam through this information as quickly as possible. I should probably introduce myself. My name is Heather Edwards. I'm an attorney with the law firm Gerard, Edwards, Stevens, and Tucker, along with my partner, Michael Tucker. Thank you so much for having us here today. And our plan today is just to kind of go through quickly kind of where we've been and what we've learned in terms of some of the challenges that we face during the pandemic in terms of providing services to students with disabilities, and some of the immediate challenges that we had and guidance that we received from the Department of Education, both the state and the federal, as well as kind of what can we do now to start planning for the future. So next slide, Mike. So we know that there really aren't any easy answers right now, and that's been our biggest challenge as attorneys. Is a lot of times our clients come to us as superintendents and directors of special ed for just tell me what to do, and that's been a really tricky thing for us these last few months when this is completely unprecedented. There's no case law, about how to handle providing a free and appropriate public education to students during a global pandemic. And what do we do when schools close? And what are schools entitled to? So it's certainly been challenging as we've navigated through all of this, but we definitely want to thank all of you for all of your hard work and your efforts during these unprecedented times. But we do acknowledge that there are still difficult times that lie ahead when your schools are returning to your school buildings and you are trying to work to bring back together your school communities. While also facing that daunting task of trying to help students get back on track. We know, that there's going to be lots of challenges ahead, but Mike's going to start us off and kind of take a look backwards as to back in March when this first started, some of the early things that we needed to try to address for our students with disabilities as we move forward.
Yeah, definitely. So when the COVID-19 closures sort of started, we were hit with a lot of different types of questions surrounding special education, and we've provided some of those questions that we received, in the beginning of March, and as this guidance has continued to be rolled out. Some of these questions remain unanswered. While we've been giving guidance on others, like I said, some of them are something we're still working on, we're still working through, waiting on additional guidance, waiting on decisions to be made regarding reopening all of our schools as we go into the fall. If I could take anything away from what I have learned about these topics during this sort of period of closure, is that I think we've all heard it and said it, and that these are really unprecedented times, and no one really has all the answers because all those answers don't exist yet. We are still working on trying to tackle all these challenges that are presented, not only by the public health emergency, but its impact on our daily lives. And two, most of the guidance seems to struggle or try to reconcile these practical circumstances that we're all facing with the potential for liability. Are we doing enough? Is there more we could be doing under the circumstances? So I'd invite you to kind of take a look at these questions. Like I said, some of these we have been able to answer, and others ones still just kind of remain unanswered here. I did want to touch on one such question and point out that we do have a bi-weekly legal alert that we use, and we have been using it to try to mine for COVID-19 closure, special education type guidance that we can issue and share with you, whether it be old cases that maybe have dealt with a similar issue, or new guidance, as I'll go through in just a second here. You can get that. You can send us an email and we can add you to the list, or you can just bookmark our website, gerardedwards.com. And like I said, about every other week, we'll issue some guidance regarding these issues. All right, so back 3 years ago on March 12th, 2020, we were issued a Q&A. And I remember this coming out, it was like just right as a lot of the schools were deciding that they needed to close for either remainder of the school year or just for a period of time. To the first point there, it's interesting because after we got this, California very quickly came out with an executive order here basically saying you'll continue to receive funding if you continue to deliver high quality educational opportunities. I want to point out something here that I thought was pretty relevant, and that's basically to the extent feasible. A lot of the guidance will see sort of language like this, just sort of recognizing the moment, recognizing the practical impacts we have, but also recognizing that students still need services. Students still are required to be taught to the best that we can, to the best of our abilities. All right, then on March 16th, we got additional guidance by the Office of Civil Rights, and they issued a fact sheet here. They sort of answered the question regarding IEP meetings. I remember that was kind of a hot topic. What do we just do with just these basic procedures that we use like IEP meetings? And they said the IEP team meetings were not required to be held in person while schools are closed. They also added, if an evaluation of a student with a disability requires a face-to-face assessment or observation, the evaluation needs to be delayed until school reopens. And I thought this was interesting as well, as we're talking about reopening schools, and I know Heather will have some guidance regarding some evaluations and how those would be implemented towards the end of the slides. But I think it's important to start thinking about all the evaluations that may have been missed due to the closure, all the evaluations that we may need to be implementing in the fall, and how are we going to schedule those as we move towards reopening. On March 17th, the Senate Bill 117 was signed into law here. And again, this is sort of recognizing the practical realities of serving students with special needs during the closure due to the pandemic. They suspended certain state statutory timelines. And just a reminder here that the state government does not have the authority to waive federal requirements or federal timelines, which are the purview exclusively of our federal government. All right, so March 19th, OAH, our friends over there at OAH took the opportunity to issue some guidance regarding holding mediations and other hearings via video conference. And I think, Heather, isn't that right? They're continuing to do that at least till the end of the year.
Yeah, as of just last week, the presiding judge, Peggy Gibson, indicated that at least for the foreseeable future, we will continue to be holding all mediations and hearings via video conference.
Great. And on March 20th, CDE issued their own guidance regarding special education. I wanted to point out here again that they're recognizing that exceptional circumstances may affect how a particular service is provided under a student's IEP. Whether or not these current circumstances are exceptional enough under this particular guidance, it sure seems to suggest that they are. And they're again taking into consideration these just sort of practical challenges everyone's facing with distance learning and its impact on servicing special education students. And same thing here, CD again issued some guidance on March 20th, saying that CD will consider the days of school site closure similar to school breaks in excess of 5 days. And again, they issued some further guidance regarding annual and triennial IEP reviews. Here they really clarified a misunderstanding here for OCR. They did note that they were concerned about educators not providing any sort of distance instruction. We saw again from the federal government their first guidance back on March 12th. If you provide instructional opportunities for non-special ed students, you have to provide the same for special education students. So at least at the beginning when closures began, there was some sentiment that providing special ed services were going to basically be impossible. So OCR here sort of stepped in with that concern and tried to clarify that misunderstanding. Obviously on March 27th, we had the CARES Act, and it's relevant particularly for, let's see, where the next slide went. Really, they asked the US Secretary of Education whether or not she felt waivers are required for special education services, and they also directed the Secretary to recommend to Congress whether additional limited flexibility regarding special ed requirements was necessary. Here on April 9th, CD issued some additional guidance regarding IEP, saying that not all of them needed to be amended to reflect the change for distance learning. However, there may be circumstances where amending the IEP to reflect distance learning is necessary to address specific unique circumstances of students. Let's see, and I might cruise through a couple of these just to make sure we get in Heather's slides at the end, which are very, very important here. Did want to bring up Secretary DeVos because we mentioned the CARES Act, and she did respond on April 27th, basically saying that she didn't feel that schools required waivers for special education requirements as part of the CARES Act. All right. So unfortunately, a lot of unanswered questions remain, particularly in regards to special education. As I said before, as guidance is issued, we update our blog twice a month. You can check back there. You can always feel free to email us with questions after the presentation or as they occur to you. But for now, I think I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please, Mike. So at this point in time, I think everybody's kind of taking a deep breath. And in terms of our provision of special education services, we kind of figured out our way through the last couple of months. And I think here we are again, pivoting and trying to determine kind of where we go from here and what is this going to look like in the fall, and what are some of the questions that folks are starting to anticipate in terms of providing services to students with disabilities in the fall. Next slide, please. So on June 8th, as I'm sure you're all aware, the Department of Education did release its guidance for reopening schools. And there are about 2 to 3 pages specifically focused on providing special education to our students with disabilities. There's definitely an emphasis on the need for flexibility in terms of all of the various physical distancing restrictions and recommendations for wearing masks, to really be able to address those special considerations that we have for our students with disabilities. So for example, our staff may need different personal protective equipment for those students who our staff are actually required to have very close proximity with students. So for example, our students who are medically fragile, who require toileting and other sort of personal necessity. So we may need different personal protective gear for those staff dealing with those students. Also making sure that we have plans for addressing the situations for students who refuse or are just unable to tolerate wearing masks or those kinds of things. So we may have students with sensory issues that are not going to be able to wear masks. So what are our plans for students in that situation? There's also some guidance in terms of our having a plan for how we can ensure physical distancing of our students with disabilities, but recognizing that we don't want to inadvertently start segregating our students with disabilities we still have the obligation under the law to make sure that we're ensuring access to typical peers to the maximum extent appropriate. So it's that balance of making sure we're adhering to the guidelines, making sure the students receiving FAPE, but also making sure that they're being provided as much as possible inclusive opportunities with their general education peers. The other thing I think that they talked about was, and this is the piece that a lot of our special ed staff get very concerned about, is the paperwork side of special ed. We all know that there's a lot of paperwork that goes along with special education in terms of the IEP process. And one of the things that CDE has said was, when you're developing your annual IEPs for students, that you want to develop it as if it were a traditional school year, and then use other documents such as supplementary distance learning plans or some sort of addendum to address distance learning needs specifically. So we don't necessarily want to write our IEPs for the situation, and it can be more drafted as if it were a traditional school year. Next slide. The other thing that they said was, in terms of establishing what a free and appropriate publication, free appropriate publication is for students, is to use whatever model or models that the school districts might be using for all students. So that's going to be kind of the basis for establishing what a FAPE would be for our students with disabilities. We also want to make sure that we're including all children in all offerings of the various models that you may be offering. So if we're offering distance learning opportunities or hybrid learning models, how are we ensuring that children with disabilities are going to be included in each one of those models? And to also make sure that we have ongoing communication with families. I think that's obvious, but even more critical now. We've heard lots of situations where students aren't actually accessing any services right now because, especially for our students with disabilities, that may just be too much for our families to deal with. So we want to have that constant ongoing communication with them. There's also a recognition in the CDE guidance to honor the fears, challenges, diversities, and preferences of families during these times. And so we'll talk about some of the challenges that we might have with that, where families may choose to either come to school or to stay at home, and what are some of the challenges that our schools might face with that as we go forward. Next slide. So I also just wanted to talk a little bit about what is the legal standard in terms of what we're supposed to be providing for our students with disabilities. So for many, many years, we were under the US Supreme Court decision of the Rowley case, which established a basic floor of opportunity for our students with disabilities. And in 2017, we had a new United States Supreme Court case called Andrew F., which slightly tweaked the definition that states that IEPs must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. And so, you know, we've always heard from the Rowley decision, it's this difference between a Cadillac versus a Chevrolet. And I actually talk about that in the case. But one of the things that I think that we're gonna have to wait and see is whether or not these school closures will be considered the child's circumstances. And so whether we may actually have a slightly different standard for providing a free appropriate public education to students based on the circumstances that we have under this Andrew F. standard. The Andrew F. case also talked about how courts and hearing officers really are supposed to be deferring to the expertise and judgment of school officials. And it's not really court's job to substitute their idea of sound educational policy for our school authorities. But what that does mean is that IEP teams are expected to provide cogent and responsive explanations for their decisions. And so I think a big question still that remains is, are a school district's good faith efforts going to affect a hearing officer's decision later on down the road about whether or not we've been providing FAPE? And that we really are going to need to be able to have really strong explanations for the decisions that we've made for individual students through the COVID pandemic. Next slide, Mike. Are you there?
It looks like my internet was acting a little slow here. Is everyone
Great, okay.
Can still hear me okay?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
Great.
So I think we're waiting to see if we could see some sort of modified COVID-19 FAPE standard, as we're anticipating that we might start to see due process cases coming about whether or not students were provided FAPE through distance learning. And I think it's reasonable to expect that hearing officers and courts that are going to be looking at this issue will be looking at a number of factors. I think they're going to be looking at what were the individualized responses that school districts took in an effort to address unique needs of each student with a disability. So to what extent was it really an individualized approach for a particular student? Also, how were school districts engaging with parents over student needs, and how were they working to try to protect equal access to education for students? So to what extent were we just making unilateral decisions versus really involving parents in those decisions and allowing them to have that input, which is such an important part of the IEP process, of having parents provide input into what those services were going to look like for students during the pandemic. And then also whether efforts were made to ensure that the student had the chance for an appropriate level of progress based on the student's particular circumstances. Next slide. So I think the big question also that remains is the compensatory education question. So we've seen throughout the guidance that Mike was talking about, both from the US Department of Education and from the California Department of Education, several mentions about the need for schools to be assessing whether or not students might need compensatory education services as a result of the school closures. And so I think the challenge with that is that compensatory education has a very particular meaning when it comes to special education law. We know that for compensatory education services that schools are supposed to make individualized determinations of whether or not and to what extent compensatory services might be needed. We're supposed to be looking at whether or not the student continued to make progress in the curriculum or the alternative course of study specified in their IEP, or if they were making progress toward meeting their individualized IEP goals. We're also going to be needing to take a look at whether any regression occurred during the period of school site closure. Next slide, please. But I think, again, the terminology really matters. And now that both CDE and the Department of Education on the federal side have used that terminology of compensatory education, we're definitely going to be seeing come the fall. We're already starting to see it now. We're hearing from a lot of our clients that we are starting to get requests for compensatory education services, and how are you going to make up all of these missed sessions and these missed services that my child was supposed to be provided during the school closure. And the trick with this is that compensatory education is an equitable remedy that is supposed to make up for the educational services that the child should have received, and aims to put the child back in the same position that he or she would have occupied, but for the LEA's violation of the IDEA. So the word compensatory implies that the services in question are intended to redress some sort of wrongdoing or error on the part of the school district. And so typical compensatory education cases don't really contemplate applying to the type of situation where schools have been closed through no fault of their own. Usually compensatory education takes the form of prospective services. So for example, a student may be owed 50 hours of compensatory speech and language services to make up for a lapse in service or inappropriate services in the past. And it's also designed to supplement and not supplant a student's existing services that they receive in their IEP. Compensatory education also can take the form of reimbursement for private services that perhaps parents went out and obtained on their own, and then they're seeking reimbursement for those services. So again, we're already starting to see some of those types of requests for reimbursement for private services that parents continue to receive outside of school. But ultimately, it is a qualitative standard, not a quantitative standard, in terms of what compensatory education services might look like. And again, it's really based on an individual student's needs, not mechanical formulas. Next slide, please. And I think the challenge with using the terminology of compensatory education, it really discounts the fact that so many school districts have made every effort to provide services to the greatest extent possible, as Mike talked about, during the pandemic. And so I think there's a concern that by using wrong terminology, it could start to foster adversarial relationships with our families, rather than really encouraging families to work with schools to try to determine the best plan when school resumes. So it's our hope that compensatory education, in its classical meaning, most likely is only going to apply in those situations where perhaps maybe the school district refused completely to provide any education to students with disabilities while providing distance learning to all other students. One would hope that in terms of defending ourselves against claims for compensatory education, that would be the case. Next step, slide. So I think we've been trying to focus our clients on maybe not using the terminology so much of compensatory education, but other terminology. So it's more remediation of skills. And so it could be that we're looking at IEPs and looking at individual students and what additional supports and services might we go ahead and add to the IEP in order to remediate some of those skill deficiencies that happened or some of the regression that occurred during the school closures. And I think some of the things that we'll want to be taking a look at is, what is your school going to be offering to all students to combat the COVID-19 slide? And we kind of start there. So perhaps we're offering to all students credit recovery programs or different sorts of remediation programs for students maybe who didn't engage in distance learning. A big factor though is to really make sure that we are basing all of our decisions on data. We can't know right now when we're starting to get requests from parents what a student's needs are going to be in the future. And so I think we want to be very thoughtful about addressing any of these concerns that we have from our parents and seek feedback from our parents. It's such an important part, again, of the IEP process, is get that information from parents about what skills that the students have been able to maintain during distance learning, and what skills maybe they're exhibiting new behaviors at home. We want all of that kind of information as we get back to school and we start planning for what the programs are going to look like in the future. Next slide, please. The other thing to remember about compensatory education is that it doesn't necessarily need to be an hour-for-hour replacement of the services lost. And so compensatory education generally as a remedy, it doesn't necessarily mean, okay, well, you were supposed to have received 50 hours of speech and language services in person, and therefore we're going to provide 50 hours of makeup services over and above what services you're already obtaining. That's not the idea. It's really taking into consideration whether and to what extent a student made progress during distance learning. And maybe they made progress on some goals and not others. And those are all things that I think our IEP teams, when we get back to school, are going to need to be taking a look at. Next slide, please. So a huge thing, and you know lawyers always talk about documentation, whether we're talking about special ed or personnel issues, but it's especially critical right now in terms of documenting how schools have been supporting students during the school closures, especially if there's been any sort of report of a regression of skills during school closures. So we really want to make sure that our teams have been keeping very good records of the dates and times that services were provided to our students with disabilities, how many minutes were being provided, and if that in any way deviated from the number of minutes that were on the IEP. We really want a good sense of how many minutes were being provided versus not being provided. Who was actually providing the instruction? So we want names of the staff members that were providing them. How was the student responding to changes in the delivery method if it was being provided through Zoom calls and that sort of thing? Were there any delays in actually providing services? I know in the very beginning when this started happening around March 13th, there was most likely a couple of weeks of delay where maybe students weren't receiving any services. And so we want to make sure we really have a good sense of what that time frame is for our students with disabilities. And then also making sure, sorry, go ahead, Mike, that we document the student's level of progress during closure versus prior to closure. So being able to kind of do a pre and post assessment of what the student's level of progress was. Were there any new needs or deficits that the student has as a result of issues related to distance learning? What were our attempts to address the student's lack of progress through the IEP process? And then what level of skills were regained once the student returned to school, and how quickly those skills were regained? Go ahead. And so some people might ask, well, why should children with disabilities be entitled to compensatory services when all children are really in the same boat? And I think the thing that we have to remember is that IDEA is not intended to ensure equality of service delivery. Instead, it is this affirmative mandate that we have from the federal government, premised on the notion that more vulnerable learners might require more services and more protections than their less vulnerable peers in order to obtain an education, which is in the end equally meaningful for that specific child. Next slide, please. So I think in terms of a few things to think about as you're planning for coming back to school in the fall, first we have to think about our evaluations. And our recommendation has been to prioritize initial evaluations over reevaluations. So if you have a backlog of assessments for students who are looking to be put into special education for the very first time, for those initial assessments, those are going to probably need to be prioritized before you start your triennial evaluations, because otherwise those students aren't receiving any services right now that may require those services. We want to make sure we have a good plan in place for how we're going to systematically review students' IEPs and make adjustments as necessary. And some things that we're going to be wanting to think about is some of our students may need some supports to transition them from distance learning back to in-person learning. It's the same issue that we have when students may have been receiving home instruction and now we want to get them back to school. We may need to think about what supports we need to put in place for them to have a successful transition back to the school program. And then again, considering the need for remediation of skills, and we want to try to use that language in developing an offer of FAPE going forward. So maybe a student needs additional specialized academic instruction in order to try to help address some regression that they've had in reading, for example. I know you already have talked a lot about this morning, but certainly we want to be prepared to address mental health concerns and to be real cautious about unrealistic academic expectations, and that potentially school becoming a source of further distress for students. And so particularly our students who have anxiety and things like that, we want to be prepared for addressing that. Through the IEP process, we want to start planning for potential additional closures. So again, we can pivot for our students with disabilities as quickly as possible if we need to. Next slide, please. Again, I know our teams get very anxious about the paperwork part of this. And so I think in terms of the IEP documentation, we want to make a real clear record of what the students' current needs are when we get back to school. And then again, base that on what the various service delivery options that the LEA has available. So whether it's in-person, only distance learning, or some combination of the two, that's going to be really important. One of the things I think that remain to be answered is if parents have the option to continue distance learning, one of the things that we don't really have clarity on right now is in California, which is unique really to any other state that we have in the country, is that we have an education code section that actually requires school districts to initiate a due process hearing against a family if the LEA determines that any portion of an IEP to which the parent does not consent is necessary to provide a student with FAPE. So how this could play out is that a school will make an offer in the fall of what we believe is appropriate, and a parent may say, no, thank you, I don't feel comfortable sending my child to school, or I don't believe distance learning is appropriate, so here's what we're going to do instead. And I think the question remains about whether schools are going to be required to actually file due process against parents in the fall if we have this issue. My sense right now is, since we're hearing from the Department of Education that they really want schools to be offering those options and be flexible with families given their current needs, I can't imagine a lot of schools are going to be filing due process against families because they may choose to, based on their comfort level, keep their child at home longer than we may necessarily think is appropriate. Next slide, please. Another thing just to keep in mind is that child find is an area that's going to be really ripe for disputes considering school closures in response to the pandemic. So when we get back to school, make sure to be on the lookout for additional disabilities. So we know that child find is our affirmative obligation to go out and find students with disabilities. We shouldn't be waiting for parents to request evaluations or to say, hey, I think my child might have a disability and might need special education. We need to make sure that our school staff is on the lookout for those red flags. So we might start to see school avoidance related to anxiety, those kinds of things that we're going to need to be paying attention to. Next slide, please. Also, to continue working with parents to try to seek agreement on extending timelines as needed. We know there's lots of hard and fast timelines in special education, and we know that both the CDE and the U.S. Department of Education have indicated that there's going to be some relaxed flexibility in terms of compliance purposes. But to the extent parents are willing to agree to extend those timelines, then we're in really good shape under the law. Also, to make sure that we're reminding staff to protect confidential student information. So as we move forward and we may hear about students contracting the virus, we want to be very careful in terms of who we share that information with. And the key question is whether it's necessary to disclose personally identifiable information to protect the health and safety of staff and students. So while we might share that information for kind of a health and safety emergency, do you really need to identify the particular student by name, those kinds of things. And to also be careful with schools taking records home. We're hearing a lot about schools taking student records home because they're working from home and trying to work with students. We want to make sure that we don't lose track of those student records. So if you're allowing your staff to take records home, we may ask that they don't take original records home, make a copy of them if they want to take records home, because we certainly don't want to get into a situation where we don't have access to records for students.
Heather, I just wanted to add something really quick as you're heading into the next school year. It might be a good idea to make sure you have the correct email addresses of the parents for the students that if you're communicating via email. You don't want to fall into the trap of sort of mindlessly replying to emails you get from teachers or from parents, because it could be the case that that email may be monitored by other individuals and you can't ensure the confidentiality of the information shared. So just it's a good practice just to make sure you're using the required or preferred email from each of those parents before you start sending them information that could be potentially confidential.
I think another thing to be thinking about too is planning for student absences. I think as we're hearing through the budget and various things like that, there's going to be more requirements placed on schools to ensure engagement in distance learning and tracking of that more than there maybe have been in the last couple of months in order to ensure funding and various other things. We know that the laws regarding student absences currently are that if students are absent from school because they have contracted COVID-19 or are receiving treatment, those are excused absences. Or if they're having to be quarantined due to COVID-19, that also is an excused absence. But what about those students who just decline to come to school because of concerns about the spread of the disease? There's not a hard and fast rule about those being excused absences. But instead, the education code allows school administrators discretion to excuse these absences if they deem the absence is valid. So for example, we might have students with compromised immune systems in terms of our special needs population. And so in those situations, again, an individualized approach in terms of excusal of those absences and how we're going to plan going forward. So just I wanted to mention, I know there's a lot of anxiety about what kind of litigation schools might see regarding FAPE denials during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're not actually seeing a lot yet in California in terms of due process cases. So we're kind of waiting to see what that's going to look like going forward if we're getting a lot of cases. So far, not yet. There have been at least 2 class action cases that are being pursued, one in Pennsylvania, where 2 students with autism are suing the state because of denial of in-person learning. And they're claiming that in-person classes for nonverbal and partially verbal students should be considered a life-sustaining activity because the state deemed tobacco manufacturers, the Hershey's chocolate making company, and a private autism therapy company as essential services. And so these 2 students are claiming that in-person classes for severely autistic students as well should also have been deemed an essential activity that should have been allowed to continue. The case in Hawaii, this is a potential class action lawsuit against the state by a group of students with disabilities who they are seeking parameters. They want the court to actually set parameters for what the process for determining compensatory education services should look like when students return. Their rationale is rather than having an individualized approach to determine what those services should look like, that really we should just have the court set up a formula. So for example, for every 1 hour missed, a student should be entitled to 2 hours of compensatory services. So the interesting thing about the Hawaii case is Hawaii is in the Ninth Circuit. And so if that case ends up making its way through the courts, that kind of remains to be seen if there's going to be any impact here in California. So
apologies to anyone. Sorry, Heather. Apologies to anyone from Pennsylvania for the comparatively much more boring picture compared to the nice beach in Hawaii.
So that's all we have for you today. I know we are a little short on time, so of course, if there's questions, we're happy to take those.
Thank you guys so much. We did have one question. We'll have time for one question because we do have to keep on rolling. Somebody asked, what does DeVos mean that we don't need waivers? How do we include those students without segregating them, especially at recess if they don't wear a mask?
So what DeVos had meant was, and there was a lot of advocacy efforts when there was a 30-day window where after the CARES Act was passed, there was a lot of advocacy on the part of both school groups who were seeking not so much waivers, but definitely flexibility at the very least for schools to not get sued as a result of missing timelines and various things like that, where I think the parent advocacy groups were really pushing to not have any waivers or flexibility, really. So I think what she indicated was that there weren't going to be any waivers to the law. That all of the IDEA mandates in terms of timelines and IEP procedures and what's required on behalf of schools, that waivers were not necessary. And so her recommendation to Congress was to not waive any portions of the IDEA. The only little bit of wiggle room that she gave us was students who are transitioning from Part C, which is birth through toddler, to Part B of IDEA, to give a little bit of flexibility there, because students are supposed to have an IEP in place by their 3rd birthday. So students who are turning 3 during the COVID pandemic, it was going to be very challenging for schools to initiate assessments and determine an IEP for those students. So we do have some flexibility there, and that was one of the things that she was recommending. But again, in terms of including students with disabilities, I think we may have to try to look at, are there other ways that we can be creative for including students? So again, if they're not willing to wear masks, are there other opportunities for, even through distance learning, for them to have an ability to interact with typical peers to the maximum extent appropriate?
Just to weigh in on the mask issue, it was our interpretation up until yesterday that the governor's guidance or mandate was a requirement that masks be worn in all indoor spaces, including schools. And then yesterday, as some of you may be aware, he sort of hedged a little bit when asked if masks would be required in schools. And he basically said that that's sort of an unanswered question as of right now. He's working through and with various groups to determine whether or not masks are going to be a requirement in schools or not.
But notwithstanding, I would still think that there are going to be special circumstances for students with disabilities where there's just going to have to be some understanding there. Or perhaps we look at other ways to try to protect those students as much as we can. Maybe there's alternate, maybe face shields might work for those students as opposed to face coverings, for example. Maybe they're more willing to tolerate face shields. So I think trying to figure out creative ways that maybe students are more willing to tolerate some things than others.
That's right. It may be that students with disabilities, if they're unable to wear a mask, are exempted entirely. And I know that the California Department of Public Health, I believe that they mentioned students with disabilities specifically, as well as students under a certain age as being potentially unable to meet the masking requirements or recommendations as they may be.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so very much for coming and presenting today. I have asked everybody in the chat if they have any other questions for you to type them in. And if it's okay with you guys, I'll just email those to you later today if there's any other questions, and then we can get those answered for everybody. But for right now, we are going to move on to our second set of lightning round commercials from our associate members. So first up, we have Greg Curry from Technology and Education. Greg, are you on?
Yeah, Corey, I'm here.
All right, so if you want to share your screen or not, that's up to you, but the stage is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to share a little presentation. And thanks everybody for the time. Appreciate being here. You know, for 90 seconds, that's not a lot of time to cover what we do. So I'm just going to cover on a real high level overview. That's who we are, and what we do in service and partnership with our school districts. For some reason, though, maybe I need to click into my, so I was still on the screen sharing thing, and when I was tapping to go to my next slide, my PowerPoint wasn't advancing. So who are we? Well, we've been supporting you guys for a couple of years now with free displays at your conferences, and it's been really hugely beneficial. I hope it's been helpful for you. It's been hugely beneficial for us because we've met a lot of great folks who do a lot of great work in education, and we certainly appreciate what you do. Here in the last 90 minutes, as I was listening to the presentations, I was creating this little demo and thought, you know, well, what do we do? What do we really do? And what we try to deliver is a little bit different from what I've been listening to for the most part today. And that's fun, engagement for kids, relevance for kids, activities and instructional activities that are relevant. And we try to deliver those with equity as well. What I'm going to do is give you a real high-level intro to some of the resources that we offer, and then we'll share this PowerPoint, and then if you guys have questions after that, we'll go to those. In terms of what we do, we work with all technology, mostly hardware and software. On the hardware side, our spotlight resource at this point especially is a HoverCam. HoverCam is famous for low cost but high performance document cameras. They also have wonderful teaching stations that are remote but a little more expensive. They've recently come out with Zoom and Guru integrations, which could be really valuable if you're planning to use Zoom. And then additionally, if you're planning to use, if you're looking for a way to add more cloud-based content, Guru is a spin-off of Google with over literally millions of vetted cloud-based lesson plans and resources. So we can help you with more information on that. New Line Interactive, that is the panel manufacturer, largest panel manufacturer in the world. And they are the ones who partner with us actually to deliver those panels to your conferences. In terms of software and cloud-based resources, InSync is a wonder of equity because in today's world, you know, many of us deal with internet that is not as accessible as we'd like it to be. InSync has a very thin platform, not very high and dense in terms of content. So it works really great where internet connections aren't that great. It's over 5,000 comprehensive lesson plans. Also regarding equity, translatable fully to Spanish and English. We think about, you know, supporting our teachers and our kids. What about our parents? You know, my own daughter, she has an 11-year-old who got all A's. Yay. She also has a 5-year-old who really struggled with this distance learning thing because he didn't understand it at all. So, you know, in support, InSync is fully translatable into Spanish with a click of a button, or in English, and it's lesson plans that teachers and students who aren't comfortable with online or distance learning can easily use. Everything's the same format. Live studios, augmented reality, again, fun for kids. The journals actually are journals that come to life. You'll be able to see that at the link in the PowerPoint that I've created. Manga High is a math program. The math program, however, was developed by the co-founder of Candy Crush Saga and a math professor at Oxford University. So on the one hand, we have a master of games, at least one of the most popular games in history, and then a master of math. And we put those two together and we get math activities that kids will do even if they won't do anything else regarding math. And then finally, another one we want to highlight is Talent Box. It's a STEAM LMS, essentially, developed over 15 years, a partner of MIT in the Boston area. This company can even supply teachers if you're feeling like you don't have teachers who can adequately deliver STEM instruction. They have a wealth of project-based lessons that students can work through to support STEM and STEM learning in your schools. And that's in a as fast as I could go about it. This is my contact information, and we'll be sharing the PowerPoint through the through SSDA and Corey and Tim. That's about it for us. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Greg. So next we have Kristen from Diligent, and then Bryant from Alma, you're on deck. Kristen, are you on? Oh, there she is. You just got to unmute yourself.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you see my screen here now?
We sure can.
All right, I put a lightning strike to remind myself to talk quickly. So thank you guys for being here, and thank you, Corey and Tim, SSDA, for your partnership. As you guys may know, and if not, you'll know now, but at Diligent, we provide a board management solution. And since the start of COVID as a company, what we did is expedited the development of remote meeting tools to make it easier to have your remote meetings. You'll see here there's a nice split screen of your agenda and a video that can be used by the board and the public. We also offered a free trial in the spring. Thank you to those who took advantage of that. We're excited. Kernville Union and Winters Unified are continuing to use the platform. And we are continuing to offer heavily discounted pricing for SSDA members for the remainder of the summer. So if you're interested in learning more, please reach out. And finally, wanted to make you aware of the resources that we're trying to provide as a company during this time. On July 15th, we're having a webinar with AJ Crable talking about considerations for school reopening. And also wanted to point you to this article that we recently published, really talking about reopening as well. I'll make sure that I provide this information to Corey, but thank you all for everything that you are doing, that you have done during this time to keep everyone safe and still learning. So if you're interested in any of these resources, would encourage you to sign up. And if you're interested in learning about our board platform and how it can support your meetings, would be happy to speak with you all about that as well. I think that was under 90 seconds.
You were perfect. Thank you so much, Kristen. So now we've got Bryant from Alma, and on deck is Ryan from PARS.
Hello there, Corey. Can you hear me?
I can see and hear you.
All right, perfect. All right, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Just a second.
I just changed it to multiple participants, so see if that'll help.
Yeah, it says it's sharing. Can you see me?
I can see you, but not your screen yet.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I thought it was just going to be real simple with the click of a button.
No worries. Yeah, it should be. And I know Kristen stopped sharing hers. So let's see. Okay, here, try it now.
Okay. I'm coming.
Did that work?
Hope so.
There you go.
Yeah.
You're off and rolling.
All right, perfect. All right. Thank you again, Corey. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Alvarado. I am the Regional Sales Director at Alma. We're a student information system. First, I want to take a quick second to recognize all the great work that all of you superintendents and administrators and other educators are doing right now amidst all this craziness. We at Alma support you and root for you every step of the way. So again, we're a student information system that's built for today's challenges and beyond. And just a quick background story on us. Again, we're an SIS, but beyond that, we're an evolving mission-driven company. And we're founded by former educators that when they left the classroom, they still wanted to make a mark and help improve the learning community. And essentially what our mission is to create the greatest generation of educators so that they can create the greatest generation of students. And we do that by building a critical SIS tool that improves the school operations so that they can empower the educators to foster better student outcomes. And as you wonder, how do we do that? There's a few reasons. Our product is powerful and intuitive. That's our mantra. We support a lot of educational practices like the traditional grade books, progressive practices like standard-based grading, and everything in between. We like to say we want to take your district from where you currently are and lead you to where you're going. Furthermore, we improve data quality by providing a lot of all the data capture at your fingertips, like state reporting, for example. And more relevant is we want to create tighter community across all stakeholders. And an example would be our advanced messaging tool that a lot of our educators, students, and parents are using to communicate with each other through our progressive web app. And we want to provide quality change management. In California, we've made a lot of mark over the past year. We've added a lot of school districts. My counterpart, Joe Dominguez, has worked with some districts up in Northern California. We're fully CalPAT certified. That means all your state reporting needs, we can handle that and beyond. And last thing is the stabilization fund that our leadership has helped with all the school districts all across the country and also here in California, where for any district that is looking to make the switch, we know it's a lot of costs that are required, but we can essentially help cover all the first year implementation costs, so you wouldn't be paying more than what you're currently spending. And then the last image is just all the cogs that we have, all the functions of an SIS. I don't have a lot of time to show it to you, but as you look on the screen, if there's any feature that jumps out, whether it's something you're currently faces with challenges or want to improve, please reach out to me. Would love to tell you more about us. And that is all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bryant. So now we'll have Ryan from PARS, and then we will finish up with Desiree from SiteLogic. And you're just off and running, Ryan. Nice.
Yeah, hopefully I'm going to keep it short and sweet. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Nicasio. I am a vice president with PARS. For those of you familiar with PARS or maybe unfamiliar, PARS stands for Public Agency Retirement Services, and sort of as our name implies, we work with public agencies, so school districts, community colleges, cities, counties, special districts. On the educational side, we're probably best known for our early retirement incentive, what we will refer to as a supplementary retirement plan. And this is pretty relevant to the current situation, given the current environment with not only COVID, but with also the budgetary cuts and constraints that we're currently seeing, especially in lieu of the recent May revise. This might be an opportunity for districts to explore an early retirement incentive. Part of our services is we offer a complimentary service, so it's a no commitment chance for districts to essentially kick the tires on a potential program and see what that potential impact would be, if there would be a cost or a savings or a benefit to the district to move forward with that. Especially now with safety and the well-being of your employees as a great concern, early retirement incentive might be an opportunity for those folks to retire rather than return to work. Ultimately, you're looking for an opportunity to create a win-win for everybody involved. Thank your teachers for their long-time service. Hopefully prevent layoffs and keep your younger teachers who are more receptive to distance learning, Common Core, et cetera, and maybe either create budget savings or break even for the district. So if that's something you'd be interested, please reach out to us. Here's my contact information as well as for my colleagues.
Ryan, I think you were supposed to have a PDF or something up, and it's not showing. It just shows your Zoom browser window. So you may just want to click over to something else.
Oh, let me try that again. Is it showing now?
Yes, now we got it.
Okay, anyway, yeah, it was just a few handful of slides, contact information. We'd be happy to speak to any of the districts if you're interested to see if this would make sense. By all means, please reach out. I'll include my contact information in the chat information as well. So thank you.
And feel free to, Ryan, and anybody else who presented as well, if you have your slide deck available online or as a download, feel free to put that into the group chat as well so people can download that too. And then last, but certainly not least, we've got Desiree from SiteLogic.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Can you hear me?
We can hear you and we can see your screen.
Cool. Well, I just want to say kudos. This is probably the coolest online conference that I've been part of. I'm definitely enjoying the trivia as well, Tim. So thank you guys for having us. My name is Des. I'm with SiteLogic. We do everything from energy management, energy projects, to facilities master planning. And right now, especially with COVID, we're focusing on helping our clients with contingency and risk assessment planning. If you go to our website, sitelogic.com, you can see that we have a COVID-19 portal that will take you in there. And we've actually partnered with CRG, who are a disaster relief experts in finding funding through the FEMA CARES Act. So if you fill out the intake questionnaire that we have on there, it'll take about 5 minutes, and someone from CRG would be in contact with you within 48 hours to be able to help you see if there's any funding that your district can get. I think right now, the problem that your districts are being faced with is the fact that how is it going to look when we go back to school, and what's going to happen if there's a resurgence of COVID-19 in the fall. You know, we have earthquake drills, we have active shooter drills. There's not such a thing as a pandemic drill. So the best thing we can do is, you know, plan for that if it happens in the fall. So with what we do with the CRG and the intake form is to make sure that your funding is there so that you can have a master plan in order for your district, as well as you can get funding through your energy projects, because we know that there's those deficits in the budget. So what I would just ask, just to keep this, you know, under the 90 seconds, is that you guys go to the website. I'm going to add some links right now too to some documentation. Check it out. With the CARES Act funding and the FEMA funding, a lot of the expenses for creating a risk assessment plan or contingency plan are up to 75% reimbursable through the FEMA and CARES Act. So I would just definitely take a look at that. Thank you, guys.
Thank you guys so much. And again, I'm going to post that link to our virtual exhibit hall, which showcases everybody that you've heard from today, as well as a lot of our other associates who weren't able to make it for today's summit. And with that, I want to move on to Kevin Gordon and Christina Marsalis from Capital Advisors Group, who are joining us right now. If you guys have any kind of handout or PowerPoint, feel free to share your screen.
Great. Nope, I don't have anything at the moment. Unfortunately, because all of the vendor things went so long, you guys, I really apologize, but Christina and I are both under a major crunch right now. As you know, the budget is being voted on as we speak in both houses of the legislature. So I've got about 6 minutes and I have a hard stop. Well, I have a hard stop at 11:30. So anyways, let me just give you kind of the lowdown on what's going on. Obviously, the legislature met their deadline, their constitutional deadline, by the 15th of passing a budget. So you're probably scratching your head about the idea that they're back there trying to pass the budget again. This is because, as many of you know, the legislature, when they passed their budget, did it without, here, let me get this a little bit closer so you can hear me. They did it without reaching agreement at that time with the governor, and the continued negotiations ultimately produced a budget that is what they are voting on now. The biggest distinctions between the budget that was passed by the legislature on the 15th and this agreement is that there is no COLA included. There is essentially a ban on our ability to do layoffs. That's pretty prescriptive. And there are a number of different kinds of nuances to it that are language issues that have challenges in that we're going to have to work through, including all the stuff regarding distance learning. We put out some information yesterday that I'm hopeful that got to all of you with regard to the issue of distance learning. There was a lot of, if you read the language, it would basically occur to anybody just doing a quick read of it that it would be prohibiting distance learning, really. And in almost every case, unless you had a health officer at the state or regional level, the county level, saying that there was an absolute imperative for you to go all distance learning. So the key thing here is that blended learning is absolutely going to be okay, and that what they were really trying to do is both the governor's folks as well as folks in the legislature wanted to make sure that districts were not trying to do a 100% distance learning approach rather than bringing kids back. They just don't like the idea of schools remaining closed and it being completely distance learning. And if in fact you do want to go that way, you are going to have to get sign off from a local health officer. But what it appeared to read as is that you couldn't do any kind of blended or hybrid models. That is absolutely going to be allowed. And if you need more information on that, we can send that back out to you. Corey, I don't know if you can hear me or you can turn on your mic, but you would know whether or not that was transmitted out to the members or not, whether or not our alert the other night was given to all our small school districts, but hopefully they did get that.
Yeah, that goes out from you guys. If whoever's an SSDA member does get all your capital advisors alerts.
Perfect. And I know that some of you, if you didn't, you can email me at kevin@capitaladvisors.org. That's with an OL, and we can get that information to you. And it's another good reason why, if you're not a member of SSDA, you ought to be. So anyways, but the highline things in this budget that are really worth noting that are positive, of course, is that it is a budget that abandons all of the cuts that the governor was trying to make to education. And again, not to dump on the governor, but he was trying to do a balanced budget, a lot like other governors have done in the past, which almost always involves them running directly toward public education because we consume such a big part of the budget and exacting some sort of cuts on us. So the idea that they could pass a budget agreement that at least immediately does not have any state level budget cuts is big. But without a COLA, of course, and most districts budgeted for some kind of a COLA because you have to do your budget now and you're anticipating the 2 successive years, you are still going to be cutting your budget at the local level. We all get that. So we want to make sure that the public understands that when the legislature says it's a no cuts budget, it's no cuts from the standpoint of what they will be inflicting on school districts relative to the local control funding formula and categorical programs. So that stuff pretty much stays intact. In addition, there is a lot of one-time federal dollars, and it comes to you in about 3 or 4 different ways. One of the main ways will be a major factor is going to be the degree to which you have kids in poverty in your district. So there's, of course, the original funding that that the CARES Act had in it, some $1.6 billion of funding. Some of it stays with the state. 1.45 of that goes out under Title I, out to school districts to use on COVID-related things. And that's funding, a big shot of funding that goes out. And again, if you're a Title I receiving school district, you will get a share of that. Some of the other pieces is a whopping $2.9 billion chunk of change that goes out to districts predicated on supplemental and concentration grant students. It is federal money that they're distributing, and unfortunately, federal money doesn't have minimums. We have to work on our friends back in DC to have them emulate the kind of approach we always do for small school districts, which is if you're going to do a per pupil share of money, put in a minimum level so that it reaches a decent level of money to actually help a small LEA. That money on a per kid basis sometimes just doesn't add up to that much. But the $2.9 billion is a sizable amount of money, and it will go out predicated, again, as I said, on the number of kids that you have identified in supplemental and concentration grant. So you'll be getting that a share of money. Another $1.5 billion is going to be going out predicated on your special ed population. Again, there are not minimums there. So how many special ed kids you have, you're going to get an appropriation based on that. But you can use the money for anything in the school district, generally speaking. All of these federal funds, many of these federal funds are going to have to be expended by December 30th. We'll have a lot more detail for you in our budget workshop, but those dollars do need to be mitigating a COVID types of impacts. But if you think about how interrelated distance learning is and all the technology needs you have to COVID,
and you think about everything instructionally and meeting the needs of kids and the issues of learning loss, it's pretty broad in terms of you can drive a truck through it on what you can use this money for. The one thing to be careful about is trying to use this money to fund positions, because it does have to be expended by December 30th. You're not going to be able to run a position for the whole school year and use these dollars to pay for that. This is not about if the money is encumbered. It's about if the money is actually spent, and it needs to be spent by December 30th. So you want to pay attention to those extra dollars that we're getting from those federal resources. There's also an amount of money, it's $980 million, almost $1 billion, that's going to be sent out, and it's a combination of some federal money and state money. So there is some question about whether or not that is going to have the deadline on it as well. I suspect it will, because it is mixed with some of these federal dollars. But there is a combination of money, almost half of it's coming out of the state's Prop 98 fund of one-time money. And that's, again, going to be distributed based on LCFF distributions. So this isn't dependent on whether you have poor kids or not, or kids that are unduplicated count kids. But clearly we know that LCFF works in a way where it funds the base, that's for all kids, but then it has incrementally more money depending on how many kids you have that define what unduplicated count is. So anyways, but generally overall, good news in the budget. Another scary part of the budget is the big giant deferrals that we will have. And people are running around right now trying to figure out what are going to be the pools of money that you're going to be able to access to do your short-term borrowing. Because they're going to be taking money, they're going to be preventing money in these appropriations from going out all during the fiscal year next year. In many, many months, they're going to be withholding big chunks of money. We will know all of that in advance. So working with your county office of education, you guys can plot out exactly what kind of cash flow borrowing you'll have to do to sustain yourself. And essentially what the deferral does is it says for you to go borrow some money in the meantime to pay your current obligations, and it pushes into the next year when you'll get that money. The problem is, if in the next year they have a problem as well, they push it into yet the next year. And in fact, that's actually envisioned in this budget. There are deferrals that go out to 21, 22, actually envisioned in this budget. So I'm going to stop there. I see we got a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to have to go in just a second, but let me just see what kind of questions I can see that you guys might have. Or Corey, are you moderating this?
I sure am.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in, Corey. I think Kevin, the big one that I heard last night was the audit guide and your concerns and work around that, because I think all of us know there's a lot of nuances in here, and the audit guide will dictate whether districts lose money or not. So I think that's a
super great point.
And
so
I can cover the other ones we went through last night if you can handle that one. I know you got
perfect. Great. Yeah. So Tim and I were on a conference call last night, which we're doing very regularly. It's an opportunity to have people from the governor's office and people in the legislature that are working on budget issues to share with some of us what they're working on. Last night's call was with the executive directors of all the major statewide associations that represent school districts. So you had CSBA, Access, SSDA, of course, and CASBO. And in the conversation, one of the things that we came upon, and they asked me to make this happen, which we're going to do, Tim and I are going to set up a meeting with the state controller, because the controller determines what's happening with the audit guide. And the audit guide is what's going to be the gotcha on all of these rules. Well, we want to meet with State Controller Betty Yee to give her a heads up on all the things we want her to know, that we want to make sure that they don't end up beating up school districts over with regard to interpretation issues. We want to offer her our interpretation of a number of these statutes, have her actually help us by going to the legislature where there are issues that are not clear, and make sure that there's greater clarity if either we need to do it through cleanup bills or regulatory work or whatever. We need to make this clear for school districts so they know the rules of the road before someone tries to cap on them for not abiding by something. There's a lot of fuzziness in this budget, and we're going to need a lot of help in that process. That outside independent audit that you get every year, those auditors have a guide that's issued to them by the state controller, and it has everything in it that they're expected to look at. And if those things, which many of them are directed by the legislature to go in the audit guide, are not explained, or they're not some work that we do very closely with the controller on this issue, things can get out of control really quickly, and you could be subject to some very unfair penalties. So we got the message loud and clear last night. We are going to be setting up that meeting with the controller. Tim and I are going to be representing your interests in meetings with controller, and we're going to be inviting all the other statewide associations to join us. Tim, thanks for bringing that up. Super important point. I got to jump. Christina Marcellus is still on the call, and you're in incredibly capable hands with Tim as well.
Thanks, Kev, and look forward to talking to you later this afternoon.
You bet. Thanks so much.
Hey, let's continue on. Christina, thanks for being here. I just emailed everyone in the chat room some upcoming the questions we covered yesterday. So I'll go through them quickly, and you can jump in, Christina. The first one we talked about last night was the distance learning language and concerns, and it's a messy guide they sent out, and we really feel this one in particular that there'll be. I think there was a lot of intention that was misintended. So we are breaking that down, and we will work to get that done for you. I think the big issue in this one is that the state board really wants you guys to do as much face-to-face as possible, and even is taken to the point, and that's why the audit guide is important, that if you don't, you could lose funding. And so that really is a red flag for us. And I think Christina, you can help out, but we're cleaning that language up, and that's one I think the legislators are very open to fix. Do you have any other information on that one?
No, Tim, I think that's a really important point. You know, we looking through the trailer bill language that we just saw late on Monday, and we're still combing through. We could send an update out with the language. The problem is, until we know the intent behind it of the folks who drafted it and the people who voted for it, that wouldn't be that much help for you. So our next steps are to get to the legislative intent and the regulatory intent of what this language actually means. In terms of, as Kevin said, there was some confusion about the allowability of distance learning in the first place. And then it gets into the instructional minutes by grade span and how you tabulate the total minutes for a day if you're doing solely in-person learning, distance learning, or a hybrid model. So there is a lot to continue to analyze, and it's not just working through the text, it's actually having the conversations with the drafters of this particular part of the trailer bill to make sure that we are giving you the guidance that is in keeping with what the people who wrote it intended.
Great. Okay. The second one's LEA liability. And of course, Christina, you're working on it as we speak right now. This is to protect our districts from being sued. Now, as we know, the attorneys are backing up the Loomis trucks as we speak. We're hoping they don't, but we know there could be some liability. So do you think this has momentum to be put forward?
I absolutely, I do. So Abe Hajela in our office has been spearheading this with some folks from our partner law firms and of course other associations. So as of this morning, we are happy to announce that there is an Assembly Member O'Donnell bill. So of course he's in the state assembly, but he has a bill already in the Senate Judiciary Committee. So it's already gotten through to the second house. That bill will be amended on Monday to deal with this issue of limiting LEA liability. Of course, not in the case of gross negligence if you're not following the protocols, but really trying to manage what is currently a huge anxiety and could very quickly become a real problem. So our work today is to generate as many co-authors for this bill, starting on the Senate side, as possible. Since this is an issue of liability, it will likely be double referred to both the Senate Education Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee. Tim's question was, is there enthusiasm for it? Absolutely. Does it have a long road ahead of it? Absolutely. So to the extent that you guys can be of service in getting your own support on it or reaching out to your locals to try and get them to see the magnitude of what the situation could look like come next school year. We're not quite there yet. We're still doing our co-author hunting, but when that time comes, Tim, we're absolutely going to be reaching out to you and your network and your members to make sure that people voting on this bill have a very clear picture of how necessary it is.
Great. And Corey says my mic is really loud, so I'm turning it down, Corey. You know I like it loud. Hey, listen, I think Steve has a question here that is about, we need to consider, we need a list of what they are going to consider as at risk, exempt from face-to-face learning. And Christine, Steve, this is the question we went over for about a half hour last night, and really the lack of local control in this is very concerning. So, for instance, what if your parents say we don't want to go face to face, and let's say it's the whole school. Let's say they're just not comfortable with that. That's the area where Wes Smith from AXA keeps bringing up, is if parents in a small community or even at an elementary school, high school, whatever, say we don't want them to go back. We're not comfortable. And that may be against the public health officer's recommendation. Right now, the state says, no, you have to make them go. And so we're working on that. And I think that's where you can have some liability and risk, where a parent says, hey, I didn't want us to go, and then my kid got sick, I'm suing you, right? So,
and I would say that's a good point, and this is really important because I understand that several districts have already built plans for next year to be responsive to the parents who, while they might not have a quote unquote medically fragile child, they're just not comfortable with the risk. So if you go to language actually governing this, it very clearly says distance learning may be offered under either of the following circumstances. And the first is under a statewide or local public health officer. And the second says, and I'm reading here, forgive me, for pupils who are medically fragile or would be put at risk by in-person instruction, or who are self-quarantining because of exposure to COVID-19. So a certain interpretation of that could say any child is being put at risk if you are doing in-person instruction. And if a parent is willing to say, I think there is a risk with that form of instruction next year, there may be cover to say that those parents are allowed to do distance learning. As Tim said, there is a lot to unpack here, and it goes back to my previous point of getting to intent, because we know we need clarity on this for you, especially as so many of you already have and are continuing to get buy-in from your community for what your plan for next year is going to look like.
I mean, we saw that Marin County Superintendent announced that every school in Marin County, public and private, is going face-to-face 5 days a week. And within 24 hours, a large group of parents expressed their concerns, but they're trying to unite and come up with a united plan. They're all going face-to-face, and we'll see how Mary Jane and her team do over there. Mm-hmm. So we'll see as these issues come. Again, we're working on that cleanup language as well. Yeah. The other one we talked about at length was the ADA freeze, and the I think it doesn't make a lot of sense what we've done. I think what happened was everybody wanted to be held harmless from losing ADA due to the COVID. That's kind of the overall thing. We already have in statute that if you're in declining enrollment, you get your previous year ADA. That's no different than this ADA freeze, except this really is going to impact growing districts, schools, or charters. They're basically, you guys, what we figured out was finance scored on this one. They're saying, fine, everybody gets this amount of money from your P2 in February to serve kids in 2021. If you have growth, or if you have growth in your programs or your districts or your charters, that's on you. And so we're trying to say, look, go back to the statute that the governor had in the May revise. Why are we doing this hold harmless when it's not beneficial overall? You're going to get your previous ADA. I told the group yesterday, I do think some of us think that the hold harmless would last for multiple years, and that's not going to happen. There's just not enough money in the budget. So, Christine, I don't know if you want to add to that, but this ADA freeze or hold harmless really has an impact on growing districts and programs and charters and et cetera.
Mm-hmm. No, 100%. And Tim, you nailed it. It's a matter of cost and trying to make the budget work. And I think you build this as a win for finance, and I would absolutely agree with that. Definitely not the end of this story. A lot of arguments we were trying to kind of try on to see, from is this constitutional to really trying to get a concept of districts and the charters and the county offices that would be put at an almost inability to serve the kids that are coming to school next year through this policy.
Yeah. Okay. And then the audit guide, you guys, again, I think most of you have been around the horn a while know the worst thing that can happen is someone gives you money and then creates the audit guide later. And we've all been victims of that over the years, whether it's a federal or a grant or something you deal with. And we did find out last night, Jerry Shelton is the master of looking at history. The audit guide, our current controller, Yee, likes to do it herself with her people and ask for input. But we found out in statute that all the big associations have a seat at the table. So they will help write that audit guide and get input and not let them do it, send it out, and then it's in law and legislators back it up. So that audit guide is extremely important. It's your federal and state money around this. And with the complexities of the language, this is it way over my pay grade or IQ. We will keep you informed, but that's the one Kevin's all over, because it clearly says in there, if you don't follow some of these guidelines or recommendations, like face-to-face, they will pull ADA from you. And that's quite scary. And then I think the CARES funding could be very suspect to audit the audit guide, and also sending money back to the state or feds. Anything else on that, Christina?
Nope, you covered it.
The PPE delivery, you guys, is, and if you guys could chat this in, we're hoping that they nailed the numbers right, but there's some concerns that we're not quite sure how they did the allocation to the counties. San Bernardino announced yesterday they were told that they are backed up on mailing these out to their county offices. So we're keeping a close eye on this and working with CSESA. If you have any new news or concerning news, please let me know and we can bring it to the bigger group and get it over to CSESA. And then I think the last thing is we're working hard to get you guys the best price if you want to purchase more masks and PPE equipment. CASBO ran a workshop yesterday. The assumption was that we could use the price points that OES used, but they are struggling to get that as part of the bid or work that you have. So two things. I think if you guys have any concerns around this area, please email me, and Corey will get that going too. If you have any, so many districts are emailing me asking me, hey, Tim, where can I get a good deal and a trusting vendor on PPE stuff? Get that to us. So that would be something that we could really get out to our members. We don't want what the governor did, where he bought $1 billion worth of masks or did a contract and they're still on some ship between China and here. So help us out, you guys. We got to work together on this one. The layoff issues, basically in a nutshell, it shows you the power of the unions. As you know, all certificated are protected, and a couple things, certificated management are not protected, and then you have classified layoffs. We're wrangling with some of that stuff. I think some of the things we heard during the AXA thing were really concerning. This includes your part-time people, your probationary. So yesterday we talked about this at length, and to tell you the truth, you guys, are some legislators that are really blindsided by this one, because they know you need to have the flexibility to control the flow. And let me give you a couple examples, and you guys know this. A lot of us we have bus drivers, right? Well, some parents. There's surveys we've seen done in districts where they're saying 70% of the parents says, I'm not putting my kid on a bus, which is like a petri dish. We'll get my kids to school. And so then a district now is stuck with extra bus drivers with no ability to lay them off. And then if the COVID kicks in, you have to go back to full distance learning. You're going to have bus drivers with nothing to do. So I'm not trying to pick on bus drivers, but I'm saying this is the type of thing. And then lastly, and we've heard this multiple times, is really create some rift between the non-protected classified folks and the others, your office workers, maintenance workers. That makes it very difficult, as you know, to keep morale up if some are protected for good and others aren't. So this is a huge one. And Christine, I don't know if you want to add anything to it, but it's a head scratcher, and it just shows you the power of CSEA and CTA in this current world.
Yeah, so currently the job categories of classified individuals called out as protected in the trailer bill are school nutrition, custodians, and transportation, as Tim mentioned. And I am not admittedly familiar enough with how you staff your teams, but I've heard from folks in our shop who work with a lot of technology folks in districts and county offices that they feel like that kind of leads, as Tim said, maybe feel like a little bit of there's a target on their back, especially moving into a year where as distance learning becomes normalized and institutionalized, that those could be the staff that you really can't do without this year. So politics all over the place. Tim is exactly right. It was just part of the major deal that came together. So we know it binds your hands a bit.
Yep. And then I think the last one on there is just the CARES funding, and the fact that what I read from Secretary DeVos is, first of all, LEAs or SEAs cannot discriminate against public schools in general. So I think in some cases we're seeing some language where they'll say everyone gets funding, but for instance, let's say charter schools that are non-classroom based, and in her language, she says you can't do that. You can't, this is a COVID funding, not a Title I funding. And then secondly, she's adamant, and the feds are adamant about you guys are going to be responsible for funding your private schools within your district. This looks like the way it reads is the LEA needs to calculate your private school attendance, and if there's kids in Title I or are asking for your CARES funding, you can't discriminate against that. So we're scrambling to figure out what that means. There's a 30-day window at the Fed level. If you go to their website, you can read the statute that's proposed. There's been a nationwide pushback on this, but this is, I think, her line in the sand, that she feels all kids in schools are affected by COVID and should be able to access CARES funding, whether they're in private or public. And she continues to say that a lot of private schools serve low-income kids, and the issue will fall on local LEAs. So again, that came out of nowhere yesterday at 10, and I don't think we've heard anything from the RSR from California on this. Not only on this, but prior to this, they've been very quiet about it. But this could take away some of your funding for you to have to go provide for your private schools in California. Christine, anything else on that one? You want to fly out and go talk to Miss Betsy DeVos for us?
I would, but my weekend schedule's pretty jammed. No, Tim, I think you covered it. It's new information. We're gonna work with the Department of Ed here to figure out the implications for you in the state of California.
Okay, Corey, there's some questions on here.
There certainly are. So let's see. So one of the first questions I see, I'm just going to kind of start at the bottom here. Somebody mentioned about the clear individual desk dividers. Are an item many schools are considering but are ridiculously expensive. If we could purchase these in bulk to secure a better price, that would be helpful. Anything you can help with on that, Tim?
Well, I know some people have purchased them, and a few that are online. So if you could answer that, that would be great. I think, Sherry, I don't know what price point you're hearing. I heard if you make them yourself, they're $45, but maybe you guys heard differently. But they are popping up in schools. So maybe we can help each other with between them. Sherry, we can take this one and send it into CASBO, and they'll track it down. They're trying to put this stuff together for us.
I know locally, Tim, that there's a few of us in Tulare County that we're trying to see if we can, my 450, Rockford's 350, Munson's 400, if we could come together and maybe order 1,500 at a time with the vendor and bring the price point down. I've seen anything from 125 a piece to about 35 a piece. So I have quotes anywhere from about 22,000 to 43,000. And when I took it to my board, you know, it was it's a little startling to them, but at the same time, if that could be a barrier to help our children be in their seats, but not be in a mask for the 5 or 6 hours that they're in their seat, and have an opportunity to take their mask off for a little bit, that was appealing to our board, even with the price point. I'm just trying to see if we could utilize and combine together and the power of purchasing in bulk versus us individually. It's just my idea. We're trying to do it regionally, but we could be even more powerful if we get a little bit larger in regions, maybe Central Valley, those kinds of things. So for example, I said I'd take the lead in our area. I'll do the purchase and then invoice out to other districts if we could all get them at a better price point.
Okay, I see some people posted something, and I'll take this forward right to Sarah over at CASBO. They're asking the same damn questions to Cal OES and CDE and others. There should be a better price than that. The best price, excuse me. Corey, any other questions there?
Yes. So somebody asked if there would be a list available of what is going to be required or what's going to be considered, excuse me, as at risk, exempt from face-to-face learning.
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on the nuances of that a bit. And as we speak, some other folks in our firm are putting together what we hope is a more comprehensive update that, among others, will address that question. So yes.
Excellent. And then this might have been covered already too, but somebody asked, will there be reporting that has to be done on what monies are spent on?
Christina, I think, do you have anything on that?
Well, I'm wondering if that, just a little confused. I'm wondering if that's part of the audit conversation that we had.
That might have been. Susan Keeler, if you're still on, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was just, most monies that we get, we have to report out what it's spent on. And if that's the case, then, and it has to be spent before December 30th, then I want to start, getting on top of that and the rest of everything. It's frustrating, of course, that it has to be spent by then, because it would be nice to be able to spend it on people to help with smaller groups, and you can only do that for half a year. But anyway, so I was just wondering if anyone knew whether we were going to have to report out exactly.
Susan, one of the things I read in that DeVos thing was, if you don't, so there was a little out on not serving the private, but if you do that, it sounds like they're going to squeeze you to death with, you can't supplement, you can only supplement, not supplant. And of course, all of us are going to use that CARES money to do both. That's the purpose of it, to help you guys right the ship. But it sounds like if you don't, I felt like her wording was, oh yeah, you guys really want a federal audit on that CARES money? We'll come, so. Obviously you got to read between the lines. I don't really know her very well, but I felt that was like, if you play with the private schools, you get all this flexibility. If you don't, we're going to squeeze you to death. So we'll keep an eye on it for you. It's a very good point, because you hate to have to do that after the fact.
Right.
Yeah.
Was there another question?
No, I think we covered everything. And if you have any other questions, we are going to be saving this chat today, so we can always get your questions answered.
So one more trivia question. That'd be an easy one. My middle name is named after a president. So what's my middle name? Good luck with that one. Not too hard. No, it's not Donald. Who just said Donald? I'm going to kick somebody's butt. But hey, one last thing, if you could help us out, we really appreciate seeing everything. I wanted to bring up one story, how the year started for somebody. Morgan Nugent is online from Lassen, new superintendent, right? So we always like to say you can't make this shit up with new soups. And Morgan came from the military, heads over. He's working up in Lassen at the high school. They're cleaning out some closets that haven't been cleaned out for decades. We all have that at our schools, right? He calls me in a frantic and says, "Hey, Tim, I've got fetuses in a jar from 1959 to 1961." And I go, "Hey, welcome to superintendency." And so I just had to bring that up because that was like Morgan's first week. And it was probably the best thing, probably one of the easier things that happened to him with all the COVID and everything else going on. So Morgan, I know you're there, and I'm glad you got through that first issue, and welcome to superintendency, and you're still alive, so that's part of the game. The last thing is, if you guys could, yes, it is John. Thank you. Whoever said John, John F. Kennedy. Come on, my parents were back in the day. Hey, listen, one last thing, you guys. I'm really looking for people who are willing to share in a 5-minute presentation. CCE called me and they want us to kind of do a quick around the horn 5-minute presentation. What are you doing as return to school so we can share it with different districts and not do like a whole 90, just you get 5 minutes, right? And you just say, I got some board members that have come forward for me. We're looking for about 20 total and do a 2-day, 10 per day, quick around the horn to help out districts to see what they're doing, and threaded within that, and I can send you the little a sample PowerPoint, is an area of specialty or two that you're going to do that maybe other districts can steal from you. So maybe it could be around something you're doing with special ed. Maybe it's something about how you got the hybrid model going. How's that working? Maybe some of you are going to wire up your buses. So whatever it is, we're looking for folks. If you're willing to do that, really appreciate it. It would just be a 5-minute presentation on a Zoom meeting in collaboration with CCEE. And they like the idea of quickly going through it, give them an idea, and give them a contact if other districts want to see you. We're expecting between 100 and 200 different districts that would want to chime in for that. We would do it here in the next week or two. So if you could do that, it'd be great. Corey, was there anything else for everybody? For those of you not at Pismo, I hope you're in a good spot this weekend, and it's good to see everybody's names. Corey, was there anything else out the door we want to do?
No, I think for right now, we're pretty good. We will be announcing our Summer Superintendent Academy next week. That will be taking the place of our usual in-person new superintendent symposium. So we will be covering a lot of different all virtual, all Zoom. We will be covering a lot of topics that are, great, not only if you're a new superintendent, but also first year, second year, just want a refresher. But we will also be covering some topics that are specific to what is going on currently and what will be going on in the fall. So, or what we're thinking is going to be going on in the fall. So definitely keep an eye on your inbox for that. Again, don't forget to download our virtual exhibit hall before you leave. I'll also be sending out the link along with a recording of today's summit to all registrants. And if you have any questions for any of our associates, any of our speakers, please feel free to reach out to either Tim or I, and we will make sure we get them answered for you.
Awesome. And Susan, I like Abraham, Christina Carter. I'll tell my mom they missed the boat on that one. Thanks to everybody. And listen, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, so take the afternoon off and go get yourself a Mai Tai or something to pretend you're in Pismo. And thanks for all you do, and we'll get back to you guys about any of your questions you have. And have a great day.
Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.
Have a good weekend, everybody. See ya. I'm going to the beach.
Have a great time, Terry.